So this next piece of our agenda is going to go to the wonderful, amazing Caroline Daly, who's been a supporter of our coalition for so many years. And we'll be speaking today on the Indigenous principles of safety, protection, sacredness of life, and basic human inherent rights, relating to customs, tradition, land, distinction between immediate safety and future prevention of violence, and reflective prompts. So with that, Caroline, I pass it to you, and welcome.
Jolene, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to Tatiana for that amazing experience, reminding us how important self-care is. I found myself, like, my hands were like this. They weren't clenched, but they were like this. And as you began talking, I became aware of what a closed position I was in. And so your experience that you invited us to walk through with you really just helped me to be present in my moment and to be present with everyone. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone. I can't see the cameras on, so hopefully people are, it's hard to not see people, right? We're doing everything virtually and on Zoom, and my personal preference is to interact with people in person. And of course, with the onset of the pandemic, we haven't had many opportunities to be able to do that. So with that, my name is Caroline Daly. I am an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Isleta. I am a full-time instructor with the New Mexico Highlands University social work program. I'm a social worker by trade and practice and skill. I consider myself to be a teacher as well as a learner. I learn so much from everyone that I come in contact with, and for that every day I'm so very grateful to that. I'm also a board member of the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, and I owe this group a lot and am forever grateful for the opportunities that I've been given to be able to work with the coalition and the wonderful staff that they have and the wealth of knowledge that they come with. I certainly do a lot of learning from them as well. One of the things I wanted to say before I started going through my slides, and I'll share that with you actually, is that I apologize for missing the morning prayer and the introductions and Jolene's presentation, as well as Mr. Jack's presentation this morning, because I really, when I'm present in the moment throughout a conference, a session, I learn so much, as I mentioned to you, and then it also helps to guide my presentation to make sure that I'm not being redundant or you know, that I am complementing hopefully everything that everyone else has presented you with. The other thing that I get from the prayer, that is often as Native people, we start everything with a prayer, right? Everything that we do, from teaching to providing opportunities to learning, eating, going to bed, greeting our morning father, son, and all of that. So everything gets started with a prayer, and I feel like that all of that helps us as Native folks and those that work in Native communities to get us grounded, and to feel comforted, you know, to be comforted, and to also receive validation in all of the work that we do, in all of the work that you all do as advocates, or whatever your work entails in working with victims and survivors of domestic violence, family violence, and intimate partner violence. And so I appreciate all of you. The other thing that I want to say about this, and I'm really glad that Tatiana was able to do that exercise with us, is that much of the information that we hear from one another can oftentimes be triggering for us, right? We all have our different reasons for why we're in this field and how we became to be helpers of folks that were in very vulnerable situations. And so a lot of that may come from our own lived experience, our own struggles, our own challenges that we've had. And certainly all of us, if we haven't been directly involved, know somebody that has been in that situation, and so for that reason, I think that it's really important to pay attention to what is happening with our bodies and our thought processes and what's happening in our hearts when we hear the training information that we often receive and may often be triggered by. So I just wanted to put that out there and to give a great deal of gratitude to Tatiana again for helping us walk through that experience earlier. And then the other thing is just knowing that many of the victims that we work with and the survivors that we continue to work with are often at a place of feeling alone and feeling isolated oftentimes because not sharing their story, whatever the reasons might be. And with the pandemic that we have been in for the last couple of years, that certainly has exacerbated the situation with many of our victims that have already felt alone or vulnerable or have felt isolated. So those vulnerable individuals that we have worked with have become even more vulnerable and isolated with the onset of the pandemic. So I just wanted to share that piece of information with you, which you are all probably familiar with. And then finally, I just wanted to say that I totally embrace the coalition's principle of everything that we do is rooted in love, right? I've heard that phrase, that principle so many times from many people that do this important work at the coalition. Everything that we do is rooted in love. And so that's really inconsistent with being judgmental, right? And being harsh with people. And so when we look at the kind of work that we do around accountability, it's working from that humanistic perspective of treating folks with human kindness and compassion. Not condoning behaviors and not doing anything that help to perpetuate those harmful behaviors, but holding our native relative offenders accountable in a way that is compassionate. Okay, so those things said, one of the things I want to share with you first, let me see if I can find this. This is for you all, okay? So this, I want to share this if you haven't seen it already, okay? And it's a reflective exercise with a few prompts on here, and most of you may have some kind of idea of what reflection is, right? We do this all the time, and at the beginning of this session, Tatiana invited us to be mindful and to be present in the moment and to reflect, hopefully, throughout the day on our experiences, right? So whether it's personal or professional reflection, we uniquely participate in this practice when our thought processes are sparked by learning activities and discussions, such as what was provided to you. We all have expectations. We all got ready today, right? Or the last couple of days in how we were going to participate in this training experience, this conference experience. And we may have all had different kinds of expectations about what we were going to walk away with. Okay, and so being able to reflect on that. So today we are providing you with some reflective prompts to amplify your awareness of where we are, how did we get here, and how do we hope to proceed and move forward in the future. It begins with us and is on the same wave as self-care and mindfulness as we continue to do this important work. You don't have to share any of these reflections right now. You might have an opportunity at the end of the day to do that. So think about these things, okay? As you prepare to participate in today's presentation, take a minute to think about your beliefs, your values, your attitudes regarding violence, victimization, and accountability. Then take another minute to think about how you came to hold those beliefs, values, and attitudes. The second one is, how were girls and boys, men and women treated in your families of origin? How might today's presentation relate to any of that? 3, what does safety mean to you? 4, what kind of curiosity or curiosities have you had or now have as a result of this presentation training session today? Reflective prompt 5 is, what does offender accountability look like in your own community? And how do we restore balance after harm has been caused? How do we restore balance after harm has been caused? And then finally, how do you practice self-care? Okay, so some reflection prompts to think about that you might want to share at the end of the day. Okay, so now I am going to share with you my PowerPoint. So one of the things that I was thinking about today as I was getting ready for this presentation is just thinking about the kinds of opportunities, equity, right? Equity, and the kinds of opportunities that are available readily or not readily available for some of our victims and survivors and our relative offenders, persons in our communities that cause harm. And some of the things that I couldn't help but think about is folks that are in a different bracket of socioeconomic status, right? Opportunities for education, equitable education, opportunities for fair employment, for many folks, and to be able to earn an income in order to support themselves and their family. And some of those other opportunities that we might think about when we're working with our victim survivors and our relative offenders that cause harm. And just thinking about the correlation of all of those factors, with to domestic violence or incidences of intimate partner violence or sexual assault, whatever the case might be. It doesn't mean, so when we talk about correlation, it doesn't mean that those things are the cause of it, right? So when we think about poverty, we know that that's a correlation and we know that that's a significant factor. But we know that poverty, for example, does not cause domestic violence or one to act violently. It may be a correlation and a risk factor. And so I invite you to think about that in the work that you do with others in your communities, to think about causation versus correlation. Because I was thinking about that earlier this morning when I was thinking about this presentation. So our work, as we think about it in terms of working with our victims and survivors, really that embracing of life begins at birth, does it not? The way that we embrace life truly begins at birth. With our women giving birth and being the bearers of life and embracing that innocent life that comes to be and comes to join us in our world for however long we have with that person, right? And embracing the person that gave life. Okay, so embracing the person that gives new life to someone to add to our community. The other thing that it begins with as we embark on this delicate work that we do with our vulnerable populations is to look at how we embrace our customs, our traditions, our language, our land, our cultural heritage, and our ancestral wisdom, right? And how we come to define cultural identity and integrity in each of our communities. So when we talk about cultural and ethnic identity, that certainly is something that we recognize as a protective factor in our Native communities, and something that if we are looking at a strengths-based approach, we look at that as a strength in every individual in our community. And the other thing that it begins with is looking at some of those core values, right? So when you think about the values as an Indian person, as an Indigenous person, what kinds of things come to mind for you, right? And it might look different for everybody depending on your own community. But the things that I think about are things like respect, love, courage. Right? We have courage. When I think about courage, I think about the many times that we take a healthy risk to have courageous conversations with one another about violence, you know, and how that happens. Integrity, being honest and truthful, honor, charity, giving back, experiencing humility. Because we don't know everything, right? We do this work for so many years, and even at that, we don't know everything, right? Because a new person comes into our life each time we do this work and gives us something new that we may or may not have heard about before, okay? Humility, faith, and wisdom, right? Those are real important core values. Our basic human inherent rights, and recognizing that those are things that we don't demand, right? Those are things that don't have to be demanded, and these are rights that we are born with. What's the most important right that we are born with? Anybody? What's one of the most important inherent right that we are born with? Anybody?
Are human rights?
Human rights, right? And safety is a human right, right? Our right to be safe, a child's right to be safe, an adult person's right to be safe, a man's right to be safe. We have a right to be safe. Okay, so that's a basic human inherent right that we have. So when we think about that, and we work with our victims and survivors of violence, the most important thing that we take action at is to develop a safety plan, an immediate safety plan, especially if someone has already been harmed or we know is about to be harmed. There's imminent risk that that person is going to be harmed. And so our action plan at that point in time is to provide safety for that person and any dependent children that have been in that situation. Okay, but not only does it doesn't stop there, right? We know that providing immediate safety doesn't stop there. You know, our work doesn't stop there as advocates and helpers in this field. We then embark on decision making, hopefully that is informed by the knowledge and the skills that we have, right? And so making decisions around what's going to happen next. You know, how do we prevent future violence from occurring to that family? How do we make sure that the children, the future generations of our community are going to remain safe throughout the rest of their lives? Okay, so how do we arrive at a decision to incorporate family and community-based solutions? Okay, because that's where it comes from. We don't make decisions in silos, right? We don't work in silos, and we don't make independent decisions. Hopefully in many of our Native communities, we embrace the practice of multidisciplinary approaches and community-based solutions and family-based solutions. We want to make sure that our victims and survivors and our families are included in that that process that we refer to as family-based solutions. So the other items that it begins with is respecting and honor, as I had just mentioned earlier, and recognizing Indigenous knowledge and the experience and wisdom that is held by our elders in our community. So you might want to take a moment and think about where this comes from for you, right? When you think about respect and honor and recognition of Indigenous knowledge and experience and wisdom. If you think about this in your own lives and in your own community, where does that come from for you? And how relevant is it for the work that you do? The other piece that it begins with is our own self-awareness, right? Being aware of where we're at. What are our own biases and what are our own values? What are our own beliefs and what are our standards and what are our worldviews around violence? What did we grow up with? What did we experience? And how is that in contrast to the things that you experience in your childhood, in your adult years? And for those elders that witness violence, how is that inconsistent with the values and the beliefs that we held sacred in our Native communities? Okay. It also begins with recognizing that our Indigenous lands were often encroached upon by either natural forces or assimilate forces that intruded upon our sacred lands, that were carefully and with prayer prepared so that our children continue to be nourished physically, emotionally, and spiritually, recognizing this, okay? So today is April 20th, right? Beginning last month and continuing on through August, September, and October, the way that we prepare our lands for our crops is really important, and there's ceremony and traditions around that. Okay, and so those have been passed on. Those are traditions that have been passed on to us from our ancestors, and we hold sacred those kinds of things. If you think about some of the things that are happening, for example, the unregulated excavation practices that are taking place at the Greater Chaco Canyon, for example. And what does that mean? You know, what kinds of regulations are in place? And how is that synonymous with the kind of harm that is being done to our women and children across our native communities? Okay, so thinking about what our lands mean to us and how that is synonymous with violence prevention in our own Native communities. So think about what each of our communities are doing right now to prepare. You know, I just shared with you an example of what we do in our communities in order to prepare our land, to make it fertile. It's been gifted to us by our Creator. And so what are some of the things that are happening in your own communities to embrace some of those practices that continue to be passed on throughout generations? Okay. So what do we know? Okay, what is some of the information that has been passed to us, and what do we learn from each other? We know that harm that has been perpetrated on our victims and now our survivors is generational, right? And we know that the statistics for Indian women are alarming. We hear about it on the news all the time. We talk about it in our efforts to campaign awareness raising events. We know that many of our Indigenous women and young girls have lost their lives due to domestic violence or have disappeared. And we're still looking, right? We're still looking for a lot of those women that have been missing for many years, many months, many days, okay? We know that the impacts of all of these things, the impacts of those harmful situations are multi-systemic. Therefore, we also recognize that cross-training for first responders is important, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, we don't do this work alone. We often are working side by side with law enforcement, with victim advocates, with protective services, with attorneys, with the court system. And so every one of those entities should have a good working knowledge of what is involved when we treat victims, when we treat survivors, when we are doing our prevention work, and when we are working with our Native offenders. Everybody should have a good basic understanding of how all of that works and how important it is to be able to work collectively. Okay. We know that the impacts are felt by the community. So when we know that violence occurs in our community to a single family or a couple of families, it's not only impacting those individuals or those two families. The impact is felt all the way around in our Native communities. Everyone is impacted. Everyone is talking about it. Everyone is worried about it. Everyone is concerned about it. So if we are all concerned about it, then we know that our interventions and the continued preventative work that we're doing in order to address violence in our community must be dealt with from a community-based perspective. Community-based approaches that are culturally driven. Okay, so it's really important for us to recognize how important it is to have culturally responsive services in place. But the other piece that's also important is to make sure that we don't generalize. Okay, we have many pueblos and nations in New Mexico, for example, and many other nations across the United States, Indian reservations and reserves and communities. And so while we may have a number of very similar things that we do or things that we believe in, such as our core values, there's also a lot of very significant distinct differences. Okay, so our job as helpers in the field is to have a good working knowledge of what those communities, traditions and customs might be, as long as it's permissible to have that information. And we also know that violence is not a way of life, right? We see this all the time on awareness raising campaigns, on the marquees. Violence is not our native way. Violence is not a way of life for us, but we know in all reality that it continues to happen in our native communities. Okay. The other thing that we know is that violence, perpetration of violence impacts a person's entire well-being. So it impacts a person's entire well-being. So if somebody is being battered physically, we know that the impact is felt physically, right? For sure, we know that. We also know that that person's other domains, such as their emotional, their social, their psychological, their spiritual, their cognitive, what they're thinking, is impacted as well. So not just the physical part of the harm that's been done, there's also been emotional harm that's been done. There's been social harm, social impacts, right? We were talking earlier about how isolated a number of our victims and survivors feel, especially now with the pandemic. And so it certainly has more of a social impact during the last couple of years. Psychological harm has been done, spiritual harm has been done, and cognitive, the way that their belief system, the way that they think about things, and that violence is not the way that I'm supposed to be living my life, that belief system has been impacted, right? Because it's happened to their person. So it impacts a person's entire well-being and their protective capacities to keep safe. Okay, so why is it important for us to take inventory of how a person is able to keep themselves safe? That's important, right? Because we often may communicate expectations to our victims and our survivors, and some of those expectations may be unfair, and it may not match their level of capacity to keep themselves safe. Okay, so those things are important for us to make sure that we keep in mind on a regular basis when we're working with our Native communities and our victims and survivors. So the other thing that is important is that The stories and the narratives, not just from today, but the stories and the narratives that people bring with them from way back, you know, their ancestors, the boarding school era, the taking away of our children from native communities and stripping them of their culture and their identity, all of that. Those stories are very important, right? And we know that there are victims and survivors out there that haven't once even begun to take a risk at sharing their story. So we know the stories from the ones that have been able to share them, but there are hundreds, thousands more that haven't been able to share their experiences. So the stories of our ancestors, we hold dear to our heart because those are our child protectors. We know that if violence is not minimized, if violence is not prevented, it harms, it stands to harm our future generations. Okay, so those stories of our ancestors in how they were able to survive and what their capacities looked like back then is really important for us to hear, because that's often where we borrow from, and that is our strength, and that's what builds resilience. Stories from our victims and survivors. So those of you that are in this field that are helping victims and survivors all the time, that this is what your work entails on a daily basis. You hear these stories often, right? And how can we not be impacted by those stories, right? How can we not be impacted or even triggered by those stories? Stories from our children, who are often the silent, innocent witnesses, right? How many times have you had an experience where children have had to be interviewed? Young children have had to experience a forensic interview because they saw what happened, they heard what happened, right? And making sure that we are doing our due diligence to not re-traumatize our children that are sharing their stories with law enforcement and child protective services and victim advocates, right? What is your role in all of that? Stories from perpetrators, stories from our native offenders, our relative offenders. You know, and some of their stories include their own victimization when they were children or when they were young boys or men or girls. Okay, so hearing those stories, but hearing the stories from our native offenders, our relative offenders, in a way that gives us that level of accountability that we're looking for, can be relieving for many of our victims and survivors of violence. Okay, so all of these stories, but think about this as well. The other story is whose story? What is the other story? Anybody? What story are we missing from here? Our own story. The helper story. Right? The reason why many of us are here is because somebody helped us or somebody failed to help us. So we have our own story, and that's why it's important to recognize where we're at with our own story and to be self-aware of our own belief system, our own values, and our own biases. Because we all have biases, right? That's natural. But important to recognize them and to acknowledge them and to own them and to be able to put them at a place where they don't interfere with the work that we do with people that we want to help. Okay, so our own stories combined with our victim stories, our survivor stories, can become overwhelming lots of times, right? And so we have to be able to separate that, and we have to be able to establish a good boundary between our lives and the lives of the folks that we want to help. Okay. Okay. So immediate safety and future prevention of violence begins with recognizing what those Indigenous safety practices look like right now and for the future, right? So if you think about this in terms of the community that you come from, your Native community or the Native community that you're working in, what does that look like? And often we are borrowing from the core values that we just talked about earlier. Okay, and how do those core values help drive our decision-making processes in place, either individually or collectively? And how do we pass that on to the people that we work with, individuals that perpetrate violence onto others? Okay, and how do we go back to those ancestral practices and looking at our keepers of wisdom, our elders in our community, and what are they telling us, and what are they teaching us, and what are they reminding us about how this is all supposed to work? And how do they guide us in our work on a day-to-day basis? Okay, so we know that there are Western practices regarding immediate safety, right? Some of the Western beliefs that we have, and some of those beliefs that we borrow from, the practices that we borrow from, but also recognizing that as Native people, we really are more about taking an integrated approach, right? Sure, we embrace some of these Western practices. That's where most of us got our learning from, right? But our most valued learning is from the experiences that we have with our victims and survivors, and listening to their stories and having them tell us, creating a safe environment that is conducive to them telling us, this is what helps me. This is what has not been helpful to me. This is something that feels safe to me. However, this doesn't feel safe to me at all. I can't even begin to prescribe a level of intervention that could potentially create a harmful situation for somebody that I'm working with. Better to listen and gain that perspective from them, because they know it. They're the experts in their own lives. Okay, so I merely guide the process. So asking questions, or even our partners in our community, who we work with, our law enforcement, behavioral health, our informal helpers, our traditional leaders, our traditional healers, our informal helpers in the community, us. That's what an integrated approach looks like, right? And furthermore, it looks like us being able to ask questions without being afraid, or to make an inquiry. Or if I have a healthy curiosity about something, then I ask somebody about that. And I enhance my own learning about that. So everyone in an integrated approach has something to contribute. Everybody utilizing and involved in an integrated approach has something to contribute. Even our non-native relatives. Everybody. Okay, so this morning it was really interesting because we were having breakfast before I had a staff meeting this morning at the university, and prior to that I was at home eating breakfast, and I had purchased some what are they called, Girl Scout cookies from a friend of mine. Her daughter is a Girl Scout, and she was selling Girl Scout cookies. So yesterday I went to go pick up my Girl Scout cookies and paid her. And so I was reading, the boxes have changed. I don't know how many of you buy Girl Scout cookies or enjoy Girl Scout cookies, or wait until they're available for sale at outside Albertsons or Walmart or whatever. But anyway, the boxes have changed and they look different. So I was examining the boxes, and some of the writing that I saw on the box, it's the principles in which Girl Scouts, the principles that are embraced by Girl Scouts, okay? And these are these 4 principles. They're go-getters, they're risk takers, they're innovators, and they're leaders. Okay, so my partner and I were eating breakfast this morning, and I asked him, I said, oh, look at this. Where are you at? Where are you at with all of this? He runs a construction company. And he said, I think I'm all of those. I think I'm all of those. I think during this time I'm this and during that time I'm that. And I was like, you know what? All of us have those characteristics. We're all go-getters in this field, right? We're all go-getters. We're all risk takers. We're innovators, and we're leaders. And when we look at that integrated approach, and when we make inquiries and we become curious and we ask questions, we're putting all of those things into practice, right? And we also at times help our victims and survivors take a healthy risk. We invite them to take a healthy risk at doing something different. And why would we not do the same? Why would we not take that same kind of approach when we work with our Native offenders? Invite them to take a healthy risk at doing something different. Because one of the things that we do when we look at the change process that people go through, that people want to change their lives. They don't want to be like this. They don't want to live like this. They don't want to be scared the rest of their lives. They don't want to continue to harm people. And they don't want to do that. So when we think about all of those things and we put all of that together, then we can't help but think about motivation. What are the levels of motivation? How motivated? You know, because when we think about change, we have to also assess for motivation. How motivated are you? Or what kept you from taking that step? Right, so those are all important kinds of considerations to think about. Any questions from anybody so far? I'm not looking at the chat box, so I should probably look at it. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm just taking a moment here. To be free of violence, okay. Okay. Thank you, sorry, I had to take a moment. Sorry, for some reason I can't move to my next, oh, there it is. So when we think about the outcomes, and I saw a comment in the chat box where somebody said they want their community or free of violence, right? What do we want to see happen to be free of violence? So when we think about an outcomes-based approach or outcomes-based approaches, what is the ultimate goal? You know, if we have a vision and we look at the light at the end of the tunnel, what do we see? What do we see if we are visionary folks, right? What do we see? We see perhaps our community that is free from violence, right? Our girls and young women that are feeling safe in their community. Our young people feeling like they can identify at least 2 or 3 people that they can go to for help. So we go back to that situation where many of our vulnerable populations, vulnerable individuals and families feel isolated and alone. So when we take a look at that, our vision down the road, we see individuals that are able to identify people that they can go to. And not only identify people that they can go to, but those folks then having a response, responding to them asking for help. So the responses are culturally driven. The responses are filled with compassion and empathy. And there's a light at the end of the tunnel that somebody is going to help me through this, that I am not alone. I'm not on this journey by myself. Okay, so when we look at barriers of outcomes definition, that's what we hear from. That's what we hear from our victims and survivors. I'm no longer isolated. I'm no longer feeling alone. I may still be a little afraid, but I'm not scared every single day of my life. And people believe me. People believe me when I tell my story. And people are not judging me. And people are not shaming me. Or people are not asking me, why didn't you make this decision a long time ago? Because when we take a cross-training approach with everyone in our community, that approach is consistent. The way that we treat people that have been harmed is consistent. We don't have law enforcement saying things like, oh, we've been to this house so many times already. It's the same thing. Why doesn't she leave? Those are the kinds of things that our survivors and victims have said. So if I have a vision, that's what it looks like. And that's what the outcome looks like for me. Much different than what my story looked like at the beginning. Okay. And how is safety defined by victims of violence? How is safety defined by victims of violence? I might have a particular way that I define safety. Somebody else that works in construction might have a different, if I were to ask somebody that doesn't work in the field, might have a different definition. But I should be asking the folks that I'm working with. I should be asking the victim. I should be asking my survivor. How do you define safety? How do you define safety? How would any of you define safety? Any ideas? How would you define safety?
I think defining safety would be a feeling safe when you move within your community. Feeling affirmed in how you're in spaces, knowing that harm isn't going to happen to you.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I like what you said about that, Jolene, because it reminds me of when our communities were open before the pandemic. And when some of these things were happening, other things, you know, other events like child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, a robbery took place or something happened, you know, it's kind of like facing the community, especially if you're a victim and survivor, and facing your community at community events. And so it's not just the way that people approach you, it's the look, you know, like I've heard women say, I know they're looking at me and I know they're talking about me, you know, and why? You know, why are they talking about me? I called the police and I'm protecting my children. But being scrutinized and feeling like you're being what's the word? Being looked at through a magnifying glass, right? And so those are the kinds of things that I have heard from folks that have been in that situation. You know, and so I couldn't help but think about that, Jolene, when you said that about feeling safe and walking in your community and surfacing in your community and continuing to do the things that you enjoy in your community. You know, in our small communities, it's like active involvement is really sacred. in a number of ways when things happen, when events happen. And so it's difficult for many victims and survivors to walk in their community and be safe with that. So yeah, thank you for that. And then also looking at, how does your community define safety? You know, how does your community define safety? And we're not going to know that unless we make those inquiries, right? Unless we walk away with a healthy curiosity about, okay, well, what does my community, how does my community define safety? How do different segments of your community define safety? Because I don't know about your community, but in our community, different kinds of things happen in different locations in our community. That's just really interesting because I know that years ago, there was a certain segment of our community that were experiencing a number of, violence and theft and, you know, different things going on. And so the community service providers started talking about having a substation, police, law enforcement substation in that area, because it was a locality, like a neighborhood violence kind of thing, and people didn't feel safe. And so how does your community define safety collectively? That's really important. And then what is the collective impact, and how are outcomes derived from that level of understanding? And what kind of outcomes does your community want to see? You know, what kind of outcomes does your community want to see? And what kind of outcomes do they want to experience? And it's kind of looking at that light at the end of the tunnel and looking at the vision, right? Because once you develop a vision, then now you're on a mission to how you're going to make things happen. And your decision making is well informed because you've heard from your community what they would like to see happen and how that's going to take place. Okay. Okay. So understanding injury and preventing future violence. Okay, so we have to understand injury from a multifaceted approach in order to look at all levels of prevention of future violence. Okay, so when we talk about injury, what kind of injury are we talking about? So we think in terms of every part of that person, every domain that makes up that person, physically, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, cognitively, all of those areas, right? What kind of injury has been perpetrated? What kind of injury has there been? And how does it play out? How does that injury play out? And how do we know that that person has been injured in that way, in all those different ways? When we have a good understanding about that, then we become more understanding of what prevention looks like, so that it doesn't happen in the future, so that we help to mitigate it, so that we have a remedy in place that's going to be meaningful and it's going to be protected. So we look at individual behavior, right? We have to be able to observe and watch and hear about individual behavior, right? On both sides. You know, so when we see behavior that can perpetrate ongoing injury, we have to address that. We don't want our women and children to be harmed. And if we're seeing it, and we see a bruise, or and we know it's happening with that person or with that couple or in that family, we can't ignore it. Some people will say, oh, that's none of my business, or we don't talk about that, or that's their own thing, or that she knew about it already before and she still got into the relationship. So as we're scanning individual behavior from the folks that we work with, we also have to be able to understand where our own behavior is coming from. So those values and beliefs and biases and worldview that we just talked about earlier really has a lot to lend to individual behavior of everyone, right? And we have to be able to gauge that individual behavior. The one thing that I often think about when I talk about this is looking at the behaviors of the behaviors of our children at school, for example, and how often our young children, especially in elementary school, how often labels get unjustly placed on them. They're acting out in school, they're not paying attention, they're never doing their homework, they're coming to school in worn clothing, they're just being disruptive, whatever that situation might be. And it's real easy for educators and sometimes social workers too that are in the school system, like they don't get to spend a whole lot of time with kids, individual kids, but it's real easy for school personnel to blame that child for their behavior and to place a label on that behavior. And often what happens is inappropriate diagnosis are identified to characterize the behaviors that that child is demonstrating at school. And so folks at the school level, the educational systems often don't have time to do much else other than to educate our children, right? I mean, their hands are already full with creating a classroom environment that's going to be conducive to everyone's learning. They're responsible for each and every student's learning capacity. And so it's easy to say, okay, this child needs to go home, needs to sit in the principal's office or whatever. So when I think about individual behavior as folks in the helping profession in this area, we really should be looking at that a little bit more closely, right? What is happening? You know, rather than asking that child, what is wrong with you? What happened to you? What's happening with you? Tell me what's going on. You know, so that's really taking a trauma-informed practice-based approach, is finding out more and taking the time to listen and taking the time to be attentive to that child. When I ask a child, when we ask a child, tell me more about that, we have to be really interested in what they have to share with us. Okay, so that's really important, is to look at caretakers' behavior as well as children's behavior, as well as our offenders' behavior. Okay, so when we understand, if we're looking at understanding injury and preventing future violence, we're also thinking about the physical environment. What does the physical environment look like? You know, at home. What does it look like at school? What does it look like outside? Their surroundings. So their whole environment, what does that look like? What are some of the things that we're seeing or hearing about that could potentially be risk factors for those individuals? Because if we see it, if we hear about it, then we should be talking about it. And we should be coming up with a family-based, community-based solution to that, okay? And then access to services. You know, what are some of the, I can't help but think about some of the gaps in services. When you think about your own work that you're doing with some of your clients, some of your victims and survivors, you know, you might hear things like, oh, I wish this was in place, or I wish our community had this, or I wish I didn't live so far away, or if I only had transportation. So in order for us to identify the kinds of things that we can do to prevent future violence and to prevent future injury, we have to be able to take inventory of the kinds of services that are available and how accessible they are. How readily accessible they are. It's one thing to make a referral to a service delivery program, but not have it be delivered. Okay, referral and delivery are two different things. Okay, so we want to make sure that we are actively involved in everything that's going to be taking place for that individual, that family. And then their social environment. You know, earlier we had talked about the social part of who they are is often impacted by violence as well. And how many opportunities do our individuals and families have to social connections and social support and their social network? Important to make sure that we take inventory of those things as well. Okay. So we know that often, and some of you may have been involved in becoming familiar with this recent legislative process and looking at some of the federal mandates also that are taking place in our nation. I think often about the federal and state law provisions. I'm really excited that now we have the Indian Family Protection Act that was passed during this current legislation, because it provides us with a whole array of protections for our Indian children and families and communities. And so when I think about the different federal statutes and the state law provisions, we have to have some level of trust in that, in the multi-systemic processes that take place, right? Because it's one thing to pass legislation or to pass a law and enact regulations, but the thing that follows is implementation, right? The rulemaking and then the implementation. How is that all going to happen? And in reality, we have to think about that as service providers, is how is this going to play out in a meaningful way, and how is it going to be implemented? Because now it's law, right? And so it's legal. And so that's what I love about it, is that the legal protections are in place, but the way that we implement what we do at the local level in our Indian communities is just as important, right? And so it's important for us to have a good working knowledge of what that multi-systemic process looks like and what it means. As I just mentioned, that there are often challenges with interpretation and implementation. So every piece of legislation that is passed and laws that are passed, we often wait for the rulemaking, right? Because a lot of these things are often open to interpretation. And I know that there's been a lot of work that's been done around the Indian Protection Family Act. And I'm really so excited and so grateful to many people that were a part of that process in making that happen, because I know that that same level of passion is going to be executed by those same individuals that were such a big part of that.
Caroline?
Yes.
Hi, just wanted to give you a gentle reminder. We're about 4 minutes over time.
Oh, we
How
are.
much
Okay.
more time do you need?
Okay, I think this is actually the last. I have one more slide after this.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Thanks.
So we need to then become open for ongoing meaningful dialogues, and leave ourselves open to diversity and different opinions, and to make sure that we hear the voices of everyone that is concerned about this. Okay. And then, of course, looking at our next generation, when we think about how we're incorporating our core values into the practice work that we do with our victims and survivors, is what are we going to tell our next generation, and how are we going to show them that it's not just our words, but our words are followed by action? And how are we going to make sure that amends get executed in a very meaningful way to those that have been harmed, and making sure that we spread the message that our lives are sacred. Everyone's life is sacred, right? Victims, survivors, children, dependents, our native offenders of violence, and our young boys and girls, right? What are we teaching them? That's really important for us to take into account when we think about all those things that we are embarking on as we continue our journey. Okay, so thank you very much. Please review those prompts, and we may want to revisit them at the end of the day as we conclude our training session today. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Caroline, with such a great session, so much to learn, and really appreciate that. Any questions from folks? Let's see here in the chat. Got a lot of thank yous.
I liked what Michelle said. Feel I can look in someone else's eyes and speak without fear. I really like that. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much for that session, Caroline. I think we're also looking forward to the afternoon session where you'll be presenting again. So thank you so much.
Okay, we'll see you in a bit.
We'll see you in a bit. Our next presenter is Mr. Rod Cascala, who is working, I believe they're a relative from the Pueblo of Zuni, but they currently work at the Pueblo of Nambe in northern New Mexico. Mr. Cascala is going to present on the subject of cultural humility, cultural competency, cultural sensitivity, and cultural responsiveness. What does better accountability look like in the utilization of humanistic principles? And we'll also touch on power and control. So with that, I will pass that over to Mr. Cascala. Welcome.
So first, I just want to again acknowledge all of you and everybody at, with this work and who we are and what we've done. And I've learned throughout time to, again, through the process and everything, just to incorporate the smudging here. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but here at the Pueblo Nambe, it's okay. They allow things like this, but you have to be, have to be sensitive to other pueblos and cultures as to what this is about. I'm from Zuni Pueblo. My mother's clan, I'm a Badger clan, and I'm the son of the Sun clan on my father's side. My name is Lulutzana. It's a great-great-grandfather. Don't really mean anything. It's just what he was called. And Nawishatzana is one of these dancers at home that, like a fawn, young fawn that dance. So I have two names. I'm presently married in Nambe, and I've been doing this work since about '96. And so really doing this re-education program through a lot of variations, a lot of, again, good information that's come through and take a look at. And we're going to really do a historical quick overview perspective of this. But the sage, like I was told, is about really the heaviness that we talk about, the heaviness in our hearts, the heaviness in our heads, the emotions, the feelings, everything, but to again cleanse us in a good way that, we settle down and we take a look at this. And again, it did not get impacted by so much of this stuff. And many of us, again, are survivors. I'm an offender myself. I'm an addict. I'm all these things, and the process of recovery. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. And then again, where we are today, we're working with our women, especially in all genders, actually, as far as what was talked about with the safety and again, our community. So that's what this sage is in a good way for all of us. And there's a quick survey that a poll that I had. So the first poll, if you can put it up, just to kind of see where we are at as far as our own traditional knowledge. So can you put that poll up and see? Okay. Right. So if you just answer these, and then we can take a look at that, and then I can continue what I want to do as far as with the presentation. As they're answering these questions, I had a lot of good information that I heard from, from Cliff and again, Caroline, a lot of this overlapping with what we're talking about. And so the historical context of the Duluth model, was again, and also the pyramid, was when I first started out in '96, Marlon Musso was really the founder or my foundation, my mentor, with South Dakota Pine Ridge, that and with the sister organization that they were working with as far as the technical assistance under OVW was Sacred Circle. And they developed these models. They developed a lot of things. And like he used to work with Ellen Pence. And so his philosophy and his thoughts and ideas were the circles and all this, redevelop it in what's culturally relevant in your area or how you want to utilize it. And he said there's no copyright to it. And so they developed it in a way that was the pyramid, but they acknowledged, they looked at it more as that's the household. That's how the dynamics of violence, of family violence, partner relationships happen is in the household. And so that was first, that was a representative of that, but then also the hierarchical structure. And then again, the equality was about the sweat lodge. They had you utilize that as the sweat lodge, to incorporate a lot of these lifeways, support values that go along with that. And then they had the tree of life, again, that they put up because a lot of them, again, how they pierce themselves with the tree, all these things that are relevant with their culture. And so around late 90s, 2000, the coalition, I had, we talked about redeveloping these diagrams. And so they helped, and this is what I sent out. This is the diagrams that I utilize. And these are frameworks. I utilize these as frameworks when I talk with individuals, with people. And from then on, we talk about curricula, we talk about all these things, but it's about the dialogue, it's about discussion. And I didn't get into all that dialogue with the curriculum or anything like that. There's more of an overview. So with this, I just wanted to know, I mean, this takes us a lot of what we know about our own personal life, where we are today, and the historical context. As I go back, you have to go further back, our ancestral teachings, and what we still have today, and a lot of it has been lost throughout this time. And I have again a time frame, dates and times that's correlated with so many things, that how a lot of this behavior and this attitudes and the policies that went into effect, we incorporated it. They were forced upon us, and so we start to live it, and it becomes our way of life, our values, our beliefs. And not realizing, why is it that we do this? Whereas we're very sacred beings. Our ancestors knew so much. They knew everything. They foresaw things that were going to happen. They knew about the trauma. They knew about the DNA. They knew about, again, the earth life of everything. So all the things that we had was honored and sacred through word, through ceremonial, through all the things that we did. And so from then on, the colonization that occurred, they brought with them so many of the dynamics and tactics that went along with, again, our behavior, and forcing it. And like was said, I mean, we're living with policies, that was first to exterminate us, but it never happened. And so they changed the policies as it went along, and all these things that were approached upon us, made us to look at, again, our way of life, really in negative ways, that, the duality that we try to live, in this kind of life. And as we got the history, as we went along, like with us here at the Southwest, the Spanish were the ones who kind of approached upon us, and again forced us, and it's not recorded, but all the things that occurred, again, 1680, the revolt happened, and again the ownership of land claims, it's kind of like this treaties, I mean, we had sovereignty under them, and then with the duality of everything that occurred from the east, with again the European colonization that occurred, all the things that they brought over, again, the behavior, the mentality. When you look at European history, from the beginning of time, again, there were already violence against women. They were doing things, they were treating things, in ways that were here, it was about the sacredness of women. sacredness of Mother Earth. I mean, we're, as indigenous people, in reality, we're the keepers of the earth, in a lot of different ways that, we don't realize how nature, we are a part of nature. We are all the medicines, everything is here within us, that we utilize, that we had, the animals. And again, just the colonization was about war. It's about taking things, so we know a lot about that. Like the plains, again, we all had different environments that we lived, and we knew about each, within that environment, the woodlands, the ocean, people, the coastal lines, the desert, again, the Southwest here. I mean, we knew how to take care of that. And then with the plains, they traveled with the buffalo. The buffalo was the biggest, again, gift that was given, and they traveled. And then, so, I mean, even that was the slaughter of again, the colonizing, and then, again, all the things that was talked about, how they utilized that torture, but it came from what they've already done to women in Europe. The witch hunts was the biggest thing, how they did so many things to force and to submit and to make people through. This was life and death, and that's what they did to us when they came here. They tried, they did every tactic that they did there, they did here, they brought here, and how they dismantled us, and how they incorporated, and with the Europeans that came, the Western, all the policies that came into place, how they enacted a lot of that into our personal life, and so our history, is how much do we know of it. But it's, here we're just barely on the tip of the iceberg, about all these things. But if we look further back, we've lost so many of our elders just in our time, and the change is happening fast. So how far back can we go, as far as taking a look at our historical, again, teachings that was taught. And so, I think we're the Creator has gave us the gift of individuals who have done, I'd never liked statistics, research, all that stuff, but that's the way that we're starting to live our life. The ethnologists, when they knew that when they were going to extinct, they were going to try to extinct all of us as Native people. They hired, they had, again, the ethnologists come into place, to go to each tribe to collect items, because they knew that we were going to be, extinct. They were going to kill us off. And so everything that they had, those that were chosen to go to each of the Native communities and to record and to grab whatever they could, the artifacts, everything else. We have a glimpse of that from what happened at that time of history. Because like was talked about, the storytelling, the narratives are, again, our creation stories. I'm one of those that, I grew up with alcohol, and so many of these things, wasn't passed on. And a couple of generations before me, they were set and told 4 nights when wintertime, the winter solstice, told about these narratives, these stories of how our creation, how we became, and how we were, And so again, it's just like a lot of these things that are missing, the pieces that we, how do we go back to define our traditional teachings and cultures, But, like I said, there's fortunate that there's other natives that have written books. I mean, there's a lot of material, and there's so much to look at and to, again, identify, even, again, Native researchers, people who've done, written on a lot of these things, the trauma. I mean, Eduardo, again, just that the terms are coming up in a different way of try to reframe, rename a lot of these things, for ourselves. And so again, it's taking a look at that. And so I've, from doing this work, I mean, everything that occurred was just amazing as far as just where we are today, because the change is happening so fast and so quick that things are just, just in fast pace. And that's another thing too, You know, our ancestors, you know, what I recall was told is, you know, we have no timekeepers anymore. There's nothing in place to, everything was based on ceremonial. You know, the term that I come up with that finally kind of dawned was esoteric. We had people in place of knowledge that could handle, and you know, there's no such thing as supernatural. Everything had power that we could do in a positive, and 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 everything that could occur. And so we lost these people that could, timekeepers of the season, of the time, and to, again, through the rituals, through the offerings for prayers, you know, when the season comes, the rains, the ceremonials, all these things, now we don't have that, you know, because of so many things of what occurred. And so we lost that. And so it's just the time, it's just running, it's going all different places. The weather is doing all sorts of things that, and Mother Nature and is telling us so many things, but we're not listening. Things are occurring, things are happening, you know. So again, you know, that's one example. The prophecies, again, I've really come to incorporate. I mean, a lot of this, like I said, the substance abuse has been a big part of this, you know, as far as the work and working with not just men, but also with women. And so yeah, with Don Coyas, this is what I kind of incorporate a lot of these, the 12 steps of what he is talked about. You know, this is a vision that he had. When Caroline talked about a vision, you know, we have to dream big, even the impossible is possible, you know. And this is his dream. This is his vision, you know, that created variety. I don't know if people understand what that is. You know, it's being both sober and well. And it's again, it's coming from again, native language that's translated to close to what they could understand it as being, again, well-briety, that term, to be both sober and well, translated from Indian word, which means a balanced being, a balanced warrior with both developed male and female side, strongly connected to the principles, laws, and values of the universe, with someone who walks the red road. And I've always used the term self-work. I mean, that's the whole thing, is, you know, to rediscover ourselves, to you know, as this work, it's about the vulnerability that we miss the information of that, is that it's being weak, you know, and in every possible way, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, sexually, all these things we talk about, you know, the vulnerability. But that's where the strength comes in, is acknowledging these things, you know. Again, they call it the medicine wheel, but we all have something in common as Native people, and the teachings that go along with that. And it's all about our human development, you know, from a child, infant, youth, adult, elder, and the cycle that we live. I mean, to find the answer, to try to find spirituality. And that's the whole thing, I think, as far trying to find something in our own personal life that we can connect with, you know, whatever that is. You know, you can call it whatever it is. And then as time goes on, you know, it becomes something personal that you can identify with. Our ceremonials are based on that, you know, to participate and based on, but we have so many disconnect at this time. A lot of things that are occurring, the mistrust, again, all these things. And so it's just like, where is all this coming from? You know, how is it embarking on our personal life, you know, as well as our community life? This is what I was talking about. Again, just we all have, I mean, a lot of verbiage, a lot of words, a lot of language that we use, and you know, that's really relevant to one thing that we do. You know, a lot of things that we do are, but because of so many things, we get so confused because we have all this vocabulary. And so the medicine wheel, I mean, that's really about everything that we do. You know, it's a circle process. Everything that occurs, like I said, is in that process. You know, our lifestyle is in that process. Infancy, youth, elder, adult, you know, and it's about finding these teachings, you know, honesty. You know, again, when you look at the 12-step program, it's nothing new. This is the way of life that our ancestors lived. You know, it, it was just redeveloped by two persons that in the 1930s, the 34s, they're called Alcoholics Anonymous. But and you know, I guess it's okay to I should have asked Don, but his story, he saw a vision, and this is the thing of it. We all have a vision, something we see, and so we go to elders, and the elders tell us what we need to do about that vision, what it is that the purpose and meaning of it that you need to do, and through his vision and through his teachings of the elders and what they needed to do, this is what it came up. And everything that he's doing, even the boarding schools, all the well-brighty, the 12 steps, they told him to put it in a circle because it's nothing new. That's the way of life. And so again, identify certain things. So again, honesty, hope, faith, that's first, the 1 and 2, 3. And then again, as far as offender accountability, it's understanding the history of where do we get these things? Where do we learn to, again, incorporate a lot of this behavior. And like the history, like when we take a look at it, like I mentioned, the historical context of a lot of these stuff was, again, the colonization, what happened. I mean, it was already, the violence was already legislated. I mean, that was okay to treat your women in so many, even to death, as far as with the Europeans that came across, when Columbus came over, I mean, how he brought things over, again, the witch hunts from 100 to 1500. I mean, all the things, the tactics came over. And so as community people, we lived this life as our ancestors, the sacredness of what it was, in this way of life, the courage, integrity, and willingness, again, it's about finding ourselves, knowing about this. It's about how we grow up, the youth, the summer, mental, again, the acknowledgement and family, how we see ourselves, recognize the individual, ourselves, honesty, I mean, just the things that we've learned as we move forward in a positive way, and our ancestors were living this, and everything that was practiced was for a betterment of humanity, and not just your own humanness, but for all things, everything. And that's what the bright is, the universe, the laws, the principles, everything was, again, in our way of life that we lived, and to walk by it as the best we could. And so again, the knowledge that was passed on, and again, the ceremonials, the people, the medicine people, all these, that esoteric, the term that they, again, those that were initiated had that understanding and power to heal, to do certain things that, many of us didn't have that, and again, even that was meaningful purpose. Even all genders, even, if you were so-called now, I mean, gay, lesbian, I mean, all these genders we're talking about, they were utilized as medicine. They were part of this circle of healing everything, and they weren't ostracized. They weren't, stereotyped. All these things, everything was a meaning and purpose. When there was what we say now today is a difference in differences of people. That differences was the power of what we used in our community. They became the messengers for us and the healers for us in our community, And so the gift of others, that's what we've lost. I mean, all these things that we're trying to reconnect and relearn. And so again, it's just, again, understanding that everything is related in causing harm, but also being healed. We can heal. We were innocent beings from the beginning. And so something occurred and something happened, and that was mentioned. But then when we go further back into the history of what occurred throughout time, and how we were ingrained into these belief systems, especially particular us as men, from boys to men, these strong beliefs came from the outside, not from within. But then yet, as time goes on, we became the ones, like they talks about, we're the oppressors. We become the oppressed now, and then we're the ones who are oppressing our own families and people in our lives. And so, understanding for myself now, incorporating a lot of this with individuals I work with, because substance abuse is a big part of this. It's not the cause of violence. there's just a lot of overlap. It's just the tip of the iceberg. There's many things to go beyond. And so this is the framework that I utilize. Go ahead and you can do the next one. So these four laws, it's so relevant. Again, what we're talking about. And again, changes from within. A lot of things we need to do first comes within. Just like doing this work. I mean, I would have never done this if I didn't begin my sobriety, you know? I mean, the prayers, you know, the Creator put me in places that I was searching for something, and this is where they brought me. This is how I came to be. And so again, the spirituality of what we live is a powerful piece of our life to live and to practice. And so a lot of work had to begin from myself, that self-work. So it had to come from within. And that's how change, you know, starts to begin. In order for development to occur, it must be preceded by vision. Again, having that vision of, you know, if you're miserable, you want to get out of that misery, but sometimes we just don't know how to do that. You know, we have a vision of what to do and all this, but if we start to do it within our own change, and again, this the have that faith, have that in the heart of understanding, wanting to do this, then this development, this vision eventually comes up. It occurs. You know, a great learning must occur. We start to learn things, you know, and understand things, and the compassion comes in and wanting to know more. You know, we become teachable, and this is part of again the natural law of life as growing up. You know, the cycle of life, and you must create a healing forest, and that's what we all really want. We talking about our families, about our children, about our communities, about the world events. I mean, all these things, and we're trying to find that, and then, you know, small pockets, we're trying to do that, you know, as workers or as community members, or, you know, so again, these four laws of change is from within, and it's powerful, you know, if we start to try to work on ourselves and have a glimpse of it. And again, having the support, having, again, mentors, having people that can help this process to that's why there's so many groups, there's so many support, and there's people that are willing to want to give themselves, you know, elders, I'm talking about, you know, reaching back to them, those that have this knowledge, you know. So next slide. And so this cornstalk, again, is the historical context of a lot of things. And like I said, you know, this used to be a tree of life for the sacred circle, and that did that. And so when they said to modify, I put the cornstalk because that's a sacred, that's our creation story. This is who we are as Native people here at the Southwest, as Pueblo people. The corn is a very powerful, it's self-pollinating, and the pollen itself is powerful, again, that we give life to, we give breath to, you know. And from the below, it's about looking at the belief system, the root systems. We both have positive and negative. And so I do a lot, you know, when individuals are referred to me, I go through this orientation, I go through this with them and explain and do a historical context before we get into it, as we're talking about. And again, the contribution of the cornstalk. I mean, unresolved grief is a big part of that, you know, that we don't realize. The depression, it's ingrained in us, but we don't realize that it's part of it. Because sometimes we feel a certain way, you know, and alcohol is, or substance or whatever is unhealthy addictions are easy to go to, you know, and not realizing that we're doing, and then the behavior comes so quickly. And again, all the boarding school that's talked about, all the traumas that passed on to us, the pain, you know, the shame, the guilt, the anger, the fear that we have, you know, want to make that change is so powerful and so kind of holds us back. But then we continue to just be there if we have support. And you know, the relatives, they're captured audio. You're working with the court systems that are referring people like that, trying to get, again, just a network of people or men just to come in. I mean, it's hard, you know, because we have this still strong belief of that's I'm not like that, you know, I don't behave like that. That's somebody else's, you know. And so we always have this blame. this minimizing, this again, shift that we're always trying to do, deny anything that it's our problem, you know. And so again, these three things are to be worked on and looked at, you know, with individuals that we have, you know, as far as what we're doing in things that we do. And then on the other side, I mean, we have this sacred, we're sacred beings, you know, we're from the beginning, everything that we have, you know, it's just that it's lost, but then it's still there. Something is there for us as far as for us to have in our personal life to make this change and know that we still have it. It's ingrained in us. And they talk about the DNA. I mean, that's our ancestors' teachings is still within us, you know. And so the violence that we have, again, we're spiritual beings. The contributions is our ceremonial, our prayer. We know that, you know, we honor one another. And that's another thing too, is how do we, you know, honor one another, you know, with these gifts. Sometimes like growing up with alcohol and addiction was, you know, this crazy behavior, the abusiveness stopped for maybe 1 day, 4 days at the most. Then you go right back to it, you know? And so it just never consistency to have that change to that positiveness where elders, you know, lived it. And so there was consistency. They were part of it. So you saw it, you existed. For many of us, if we had examples of people like that in our elders, and going further back, I mean, that's who were killed off in the colonization. People who had these gifts, had this knowledge, had this way of life, they were the ones who were killed off because of this, so that we would be, again, annihilated in ways that we exist, but we're trying to find things in our ways. And again, the behavior that goes along with that, you know, again, laughter, strength, courage, again, just all these positive way of life that we exert. You know, what was talked about a while ago was, again, the energy that we give out. If we do our own work and we understand and we're open and we're honest within ourselves, and we've done, again, let go of our past and learning to forgive and making amends. And again, this is the process of what we're trying to do with people that we're working with that do harm, you know, understanding that, you know, yes, we done ugly things, but we can change, you know. And a lot of it is about addiction, you know, letting to not take that first drink or drug or utilize something that's, you know, harmful to oneself, you know. And that's where the support, that's where the, so it coincides with everything. When I first came into this work, you know, like Cliff was talking about, my first training was about collusion, you know, empower and control, you know, and what that meant. And then they told me this is not a support group, but yet as time goes on, that's what it becomes. We are the examples. And when I first started working, I I think we were the only Native people that we co-facilitated, a men and a women. You know, for 12 years we did these groups. You know, and mixed the conferences we went to. We you know, we thought we tried to find out what we were doing, if we're doing okay or not. Sometimes we found out that we were doing a lot more than others that were thinking about what they were trying to do, we were already doing, you know. So again, it's creativeness, this innovative, this compassion to have that and to listen, but then also to to use these diagrams as a framework to again question and open-endedness. And the friend, as a facilitator, the most important equipment is writing on something, their words, putting it down and going back on it. And again, as we're doing things, and there's other, again, so much material, different things, vignettes, control logs, all these things that we can talk about as far as that change to occur. So next slide. And I see this as, when we talk about tradition and sacred way and our lifestyle, this is what I consider sacredness. I mean, this is the way of life. This is what's sacred. This is how we should be treating each other, you know, all genders in this way, to be open, to be honest, again, to listen, to support, to understand the dynamics, to learn about who we are. and to have that historical context of, again, of our ancestors' way of life was being, this is the way we are. That's what our ceremonials are all about. That's what our prayers are all about. That's the prayer. That's what's talking about. That's what I said. If we don't understand our language, sometimes it's really difficult, or if we don't talk our language, sometimes it's very difficult. We may know the language and we say all these, eloquent prayers, but are we living it? What does it really mean? That's the thing of it. There's a lot of old language that's used that I don't understand either. And so it's like, where do I go to? Who do I talk to? Because a lot of the elders that passed on, even the older ones, my grandmas, aunts, some of them don't even know that either. They try to find what does that word mean? What does this really entail? So we're in this process, I think many of us, the teachings, the language itself, we kind of lose the really true essence and understanding of that. So it's going back to that. And so for those of us, some of us that don't talk our language, but how much do we understand? How much do we understand that language when they're talking? If we don't understand, if we can't talk it, do we understand it? And so I think a lot of us are in that stage. And then we don't even talk about, again, our identity. Who are we? Because many of us are half and half, quarter this, quarter that, all these things that from our ancestries that we are, and again, to know and acknowledge that, we're human beings. We're trying our best to do the best of things that's available at this moment in time and utilize. That's why I utilize this smudging. I mean, here, they, they're part of the lost of what occurred to the younger ones are trying to bring things back, but there's a lot of elders, and so they're having the support of other pueblos. But again, the thing of it is, how much do we try to do in order for the community to participate? It comes back to us doing our own work, to be the example as a spiritual leader, to live this and life to go on. No, creator, the creator will. To that creator will. No, go back. Um, or are you telling me about the time? So the creator is really basic, simple, again, how we communicate with each other, how we honor one another, through the sacredness of what we have, the lifestyle. So again, you can go ahead and change that over. Go next slide. This creator will, again, is how we live as far as relating with another. Again, not taking things, sacred objects that don't be, having, again, the input of women, having the input of elders, having, again, honoring yourself and others in ways, and really basic principles that go along with this, as far as looking at this behavior that we interact, so the creator, and knowing that that's our essence of being, of being, is having a connection with something that powerful than ourselves, that we know, whatever we choose to call it, because we're diverse. I mean, anything that has meaning to us, that has purpose for us, that interconnect us in my heart, that's the best intentions possible, then that's what we can rely on at the moment. But then also, again, how we treat one another, out of this dignity was talked about, this respect, this honor, and understanding our own behavior, attitudes, beliefs, working on these things as we move forward. So next one, go ahead and go. Next slide. And so again, it's redeveloping, and this was looked at. And so again, the history comes with this, again, all the technology that occurred, everything that happened in the European context of things, all the devastation, all the termination, everything, the policies that came into place, the Christianity, everything that occurred, the boarding school, all these things, were just so, again, rapid. The transit system was the railroad, how they came, the cavalry, the massacres, the genocides, the biological warfare, alcohol was the biggest thing that they utilized to attack. And again, from the beginning of when they came, in the 1700s, the native people saw their communities devastated, and turning everything to the colonizers with alcohol, and they saw the destruction in their communities. They already had a glimpse of this. And so they're already trying to have sobriety movements, a lot of things that occurred. So there was a few individuals, tribes. And then this is how, again, the Native American church came to be, again, a process of how we endured all these and our ancestors that sacrificed their lives, that were killed off, that were done because of and the torture that happened in European, the witch hunts, everything that occurred, they just implemented onto us that same behavior, tactics, torture, to the point to where some of our tribes don't exist, and we're not, but through our ancestors, the ones that are prayer and ceremonial and everything, we're the fortunate ones to exist today. We're the fortunate ones to have at least that breath of life today that we're trying to relearn. And these things we're talking about, I always used to kind of joke that here we are using federal funding, trying to relearn or bring back our cultural traditional ways, and in some way that's good. But then again, it's hard because we to have a community. We need to have our community involvement in everything that we're doing. So again, this picture is just a really an illustration of, again, what happened then, where we are, and who we still are today as as powerful beings, and the things that we are trying to do innovatively, creatively, and making things work. And we are, I'm hearing some things. I'm hearing a lot of things, as far as, and witnessing from other tribes, nations, other men, this work that's occurring, and it's broadening, so there is, again, the intervention of the divine, the creator, placing medicine into people. And then that's what this world variety about. It's coming that we don't realize that we're part of, and that we all are, so it's beginning. Next slide. And I send you a time frames and all that. And so this is how we've learned. And then again, this was the power and control wheel. This is the hierarchy that was the pyramid that was talked about. So implement and put it into as a adobe. Our home is Adobe, and many times, I mean, that's where this occurs. When we talk about domestic violence. And so again, all the dynamics that go along with that, and everything else that, and again, that was talked about too. Many times, I mean, I experienced this growing up, but then never intervened. We all, just left everybody to themselves when this occurred. Nobody got in their business. Nobody just kind of let them be. And so again, it's just how we, learned this and adapted it from, again, what was passed on to us, as time goes on. And then again, the laws that were created, all the things that occur through policy, through making the laws, the DV codes, all these things, domestic violence codes, again, the mandatory arrests and things like that. But then yet we're still challenged with a lot of these things again, and all that was talked about, these dynamics, in everything we do. So it's understanding this. And then again, this is where certain ways of, again, this conversation out, even just going one by one with the group process. And identifying it, have you done this? And then an explanation. Because you see, that's that process. This is a process that happens. They may not like it, but then yet, as time goes on, the more, as a group process, some change and then some understand. And so they become the mentors to others to challenge them. I mean, that's the ideal process of a group, when things, they challenge themselves individually and taking a look at this. And then again, relating with what's sacred, how to replace that, into, again, a way of life, even though, I mean, it's go back to the environment, but then yet again, it's how you put it into place with some of the tools that we again utilize and again having to just practice on, and talk about, and think about, and just again, we're thinking beings, our thought process, next slide. And so again, this sound phase too was another one, just the circle that they had, a medicine wheel. But again, it gives you again some historical perspective again about awareness, about our past, knowing about the dynamics, both the power and control, the equality wheel, all these dynamic shifts. And again, having the woman's voice in place to understand this and know. And then the sun is a powerful thing there. But that's who we pray to, That's again gives light to us, that's our path, how we again exist today as human here and all beings, and again and how it nourishes, the sustainability of what we eat and what we have to have in our own personal life of living, what's ongoing, figuring us out, just social things, what's going on today, just understanding, knowing that tomorrow, again, just what do I need to know? Just some, again, vision, certain things that I need to do, skill work, again, rebuilding the relationships, rebuilding, again, trust, all these things. And again, just the work as we're moving forward to have them to be part of that process and looking at that in the future, what do you envision, helping others, doing something with their family, helping, again, being a role model, being all these things. So again, different things that can be discussed and looked at as far as just the framework of this. So next PowerPoint. And when we actually would try to start to train mentors, facilitators, and the facilitators we had at that time, we came up with to simplify this process. And what is it, and then these were all circles, but the coalition at that time, they replaced it with the pottery and the pots. And so it's just like, wow, so it's awesome, because as a group process, if we take a look at it, anytime we're in a group process, spirituality has to be the center of everything, everything we do. And so again, however you open it, it has to be centered, it has to be grounded, it have to be in a safe space, a safe place for all of us to have something that we are worthy of, and know that we have our voice. The I voice is about just ourselves, not talking about anybody else, but how we utilize ourselves by I voice. I did this, I feel this way. Just really trying to encourage that themselves. It's a helpful guidance. Confidentiality, again, it's the more we spend time together, the honest we become, the more we start to trust, so again, and then what stays here, we stay here, but then again, the mandatory reporting that goes along with that, in case, so again, just creating that safe space for even just our relatives that do cause harm or do harm. Inclusiveness, we all are valuable, everyone has a value of something, everybody has a gift, there's everything, something that's have that we all can share and utilize, and try not to force anything on them, trying to at least have them to participate, in discussion and talk, and having, again, some of the group members kind of push that, to have them to, take the lead in doing these things. And again, just the self-awareness, knowing violence and non-violence, understanding the dynamics and understanding the sacredness of what we live. And again, a lot of it is, again, the pyramid that we live, again, just a hierarchical structure of how we look at isolation. Substance is a big part of that, power over, power under. Sometimes we isolate and not realize how we do that, even in big crowds, we don't want to participate or something. I mean, so again, another added way of looking at how we isolate, how we disconnect, and many of it too, the mental whatever going on emotionally with us. So again, so this is a process, and it's a change that happens not that quickly, but it occurs as we're doing work with individuals, and as they participate, continue to be part of this whole thing. Next slide. And again, just part of this tool is that self-talk. We all are thinking beings. So whatever we think, that's who we become. That's this so powerful that we don't realize how much connection we have in our head to make our actions, our thoughts, our beliefs, our values go along with that. And so again, even for some of us men, we don't even understand what our feelings are. We have no understanding of sometimes what feelings are. And so it's understanding, getting to know what these certain things, and like many said a while back about naming, learning how to name things, so I think that's the thing of it. Oh, so this is the way I feel, like for a long time I felt a certain way when sunsets would happen, or just a certain season or whatever, and I never realized that there was some depression there, but always there was loneliness, and so loneliness was a feeling. I never realized that. So again, little things like this that, just, having that connection with what that feeling is, and knowing, and crying is a big piece. Again, as men growing up, boys growing up, men don't cry, be tough, be strong, all these hypocrisies and contradictions and everything that we live by, it's an unlearning. And again, being that example to live it, to prove, to see. And so again, some tools and examples of looking at a lot of these things. So again, I mean, this is just, like I said, a really brief history of just trying to take a look at everything. And then these are diagrams that are just frameworks for everything that, again, the Duluth model is, like I said, all these things. I mean, there's other lot of good trainings that occurred. The closest one that, kind of relates with relationships and how we work, and also as facilitators. I mean, we need to be part of that process when we're facilitating with people. We can, again, share our story to a point to where if somebody don't get it, we give them an example of our own personal story if we done that before, And so again, we're not counselors, and again, all these contradictions that we have, to kind of look at, what groups are and how to facilitate, and you should do this, you should do, but again, how we relate with them. These are my relatives, or somebody for that to take a look at. And sometimes, I mean, they may not be capable of it, but then yet, you give them those tools, you give them whatever resources available to have that in place for them to continue, and so to make this change, so that's the, again, really brief again overview. I mean, there's so much that it can incorporate into the group process. Everything is relevant. You can kind of pull out of your hat, or even when there's check-in, really brief check-ins, something comes up. It can, again, that's why having something to write on, so that it's their thoughts, it's their words. So you go back onto it, and everybody has a chance to express or say something. So again, it's that educational piece of taking a look at, we're all in this together, and we're trying our best to make this change possible. But, I mean, it's only you need to do within yourself the change, and from then on, everything is possible. Just having that teachable moment, to be there, to have that understanding, to have that relationship in some level, even if it's nonverbal. It's just, again, the energy, that's what it really comes down to. We're energy beings. We have this, we sense something, we know something, we can feel it. And so again, we can go off of that. I think women are very good with that. Us men, we're relearning a lot of these things, a lot of the stuff that we, again, intuitively within our heart, going back to it, going back to our heart to know that, this is possible. This is what we can do. So any, I don't know the time. If there's any questions or thoughts, or please share.
Do folks have any questions? And we did drop a lot of resources there into the chat for folks. These are all pieces of the slides that Mr. Cascala shared with us. So feel free to download those and utilize that within your intervention programming or community work, or wherever you feel like this information would apply. I know we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so I just wanted to open the floor up for questions. What are folks thinking? What are some reflections from the presentation so far?
I really appreciated Rod's presentation, and I want to thank you for all the information that you provided us. I was jotting down a bunch of notes here. And one of the things, several things, but one of the things that captured my interest is how valuable it seems to be for individuals that are struggling with substance abuse issues and folks that are struggling with offender behaviors, and how the group process can be so valuable and effective. When I think about accountability, I guess that in that group process, it would seem like there's some level of relationship building that takes place and some level of relating to one another, and how it might be possible for them to be able to call each other out or hold each other accountable, or confronting, hopefully gently confronting without disrespect, or how someone talking about their behavior serves as a mirror for another individual in that group, you know, that might be having difficulty admitting their behaviors and is in denial or whatever. So I just really appreciate your discussion on the group process and how folks are able to relate to one another. Thank you, Rod.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, that's why I do an orientation. It used to just be open and they come in, and then you have to stop and explain the process, explain power and control, explain equality, explain all this. And so as throughout the years gone on, it's a lot more easier and it's a lot more approachable, and you build that relationship with an individual by doing the orientation. And so it may take a couple of days, maybe 3 days, to go through the diagrams just to have them to understand that and their language. You know, so when they go into the group, then they understand this language. You can bring this up, and so you don't have to stop and pause and explain to them where everybody else had already heard that. So as time goes on, you learn a different process to make it easier to have things in group process, you know. And so that's the thing of it, is just having that in place to know, you know, if you have the time, and that's what's so hard, you know, if you have the time. I mean, sometimes, you know, we're in this hierarchical structure as well too, the chain of command and time and location and all that stuff that goes along with that. But anyway, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that observation, Ms. Daly. Are there any other questions or reflections that folks would like to share?
And if they do have any questions later on, they can email me, or I can, you know, explain or try my best to do whatever I can to connect with them in every way, anyway. Great.
And I just want to also extend my appreciation, Mr. Cascala, also utilizing the corn stalk, where at the base root, you talk about some of the root causes of violence. And then as the stalk goes up, you talk about some of the issues folks might be facing. I think when we talk about accountability, we're incorporating what changes need to happen into the system, right? But the other piece of that is the self-accountability. What does that look like? You know, we're all responsible for our own healing. We're all responsible for our behaviors and how we show up in spaces. And I think conveying those types of principles and those Indigenous values that we know that were within our systems is a means to recreate that balance and harmony between the offender, their behavior, and how they're also accountable to the person that they've caused harm to. So these are really, really important deep concepts that we're talking about here, folks. And I know for me, because although I'm Dene, some of these concepts kind of still go over my head because I'm still learning about what that connection is, right? And so these are, and I just want to acknowledge that Miss Daly and Mr. Cascala are the auntie and uncle who've been in this BIP movement for so many years, and they're the experts that are sharing space with us today. So they're also very open. Like if you have any questions, or maybe you're curious about something, now is a great time to ask that question. But I do see a hand up from my sister Tiffany, so I'm going to pass it to you, Tiff.
Hi, sorry, I was in and out of today's very important discussion on the people who cause harm. And, I do realize and recognize that we're all capable of causing harm to each other, and our own relatives are, the folks causing harm in our own communities, such as, our parents, our uncles, our brothers, maybe another person in our lives, our partners that we truly do love and care about. So maybe this is a question that perhaps Caroline or Rod may have already answered, but I may have missed it. But how do we approach the people that are causing harm in our lives in a non-harmful way, where accountability is starting to take place? And because I know in our own small families, it can be very scary to ask for that accountability, because there's always a backlash. Like, well, that's my husband, or that's my brother, you don't treat him that way, or but we're not treating them anyway. We just want, accountability for the harm that they've caused.
I think, oh, did you want to go first, Ron?
Go ahead.
Oh, I think one of the things, thank you for your question, Tiffany. One of the things that, and that's really hard to do, right? Because we all have relatives in our families that have either been victims and survivors, and have perpetrated harm to our relatives, our siblings, or whatever the case might be. And so I know that for me personally, it really helps. Because Jolene, I have to go back to the times that you have always said everything that we do is rooted in love. And I really embrace that and try to practice that in my own life with folks that I might be upset about that have caused harm in my own family. And so just some disclosure there, but it helps me personally, and I've used this information professionally as well, is learning how to separate the behavior from the person, especially if we are looking at it from a humanistic approach, and on a do no harm sort of practice base, and looking at the behavior. Looking at the behavior, that hate behavior should not be condoned. I don't condone that behavior. I don't like that behavior. I don't accept that behavior. But you're my sister, or you're my brother, or you're my uncle, whatever, and I love you. But I don't like what you're doing. I think, at least in my family, that's something that has been useful to us in order to move forward. And I see moving forward different than moving on, moving forward. And it's a tough journey, it's not easy. And when we have discussions with other people that are struggling with this, we do say that, we're honest, and we exercise integrity and say, no, it's not easy. When a client or somebody says, somebody I'm working with says, you don't know what it's like, it's not easy. It might be easy for you to say, of course it's not easy. We recognize that, and we acknowledge that, and we own it for ourselves, because probably we can relate to it. So anyway, I don't know if that helps, but I know that that's one of the things that has helped me in my own life, and also in my work life as well.
Yeah, yeah, with their own family and the kids, especially, and trying to do a lot of these things and in a good way, and to say this, but they get offended right away, get pissed off, they get angry and all this, and so it really all comes down to, kind of was mentioned. I love you, I care for you. There's a lot of help out there for you. If you need to, if you want, I can help you if you need to, if you need it. But that's it, really, because I try to share my own personal recovery, to story. They get upset, angry right away, and so, once depends on what the behavior and action is, I can call somebody to have them to kind of talk to them as well too, by having somebody else. They're more receptive to someone than yourself, if it's a family member at times. So again, having these connections, having somebody to, well, and then, have them think about it for a while, and then after it cools down, where there's this individual, if you choose to want to talk to him. So that's kind of what in our own family, that's kind of what's occurred, So, it's challenging, but yeah, thank you for that. Yes.
Thank you, Rod and Caroline, because that is, something very scary when you don't condone it and you want to, be an advocate for another family member, but it's a scary thing when it could be within your own family, and what can come out of that. And it's just, I see more violence coming out of that disclosure of trying to advocate for another family member when it's wrong. And I think that's why a lot of our own people in tribal communities stay silent. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, Tiffany, and very thoughtful guiding answers from Caroline and Rod, and really appreciate that. I think just to close out this session before we go into a break is one thing that I think when we're talking about matter intervention is we don't think about also pieces of kinship. Many of us are related to the persons who may cause harm, and in a lot of communities, I know we talked a little bit about the Sonny Boy syndrome earlier, but also there is that deep love that we have for relatives who cause harm. And Caroline's right. We need to pull apart the behavior from the person and who they are, and I think addressing those pieces through healing conversations, through I think continued gentleness. Something that I just like a lesson my dad always told me is he says, wherever you go, the people you encounter, you don't know what their journey is and you don't know what they go through. And maybe they may say or do something that you don't agree with, but that doesn't make them any less deserving of understanding. But there are ways to encourage that accountability. Some other community accountability ways that we have talked about within our coalition are things like when we bring those relatives back into our circles, right? After they've caused harm, what does that look like? We're thinking like, is that programs where our offender relatives might maybe gather and chop wood for the elders. Maybe they're in charge of the community gardening and that they sustain that. Perhaps it's working with one another, having a supportive group with one another. And those are all forms of accountability as well. So as you implement some of these concepts into your BIP programming, or even the community work that you're doing, it's really important to think about what are those healing conversations and what does accountability look like? So with that, we'll go ahead and go into our break. It's 3:35. If folks could return at 3:40, we will continue our training.
Yeah, I just wanted to go put in chat was every Wednesday evenings. I mean, we've continued to do this as, again, just a circle virtual gathering at 7 p.m. So anybody can participate if they choose to. So again, it's individuals who've done their own work as well. So I'll just put that in chat just in case. Thank you.
So with that, I think we can go ahead and move on to the next piece of our training. And thank you to folks who have been with us since 9 a.m. I know it's a long day, but it's important information. It's necessary, and really happy that you're still with us. So this next presentation is by Ms. Caroline Daly again. And this is going to go over the coordinated community responses and restorative justice best practices for victim safety and offender accountability. So with that, Caroline, I will pass it over to you.
So I sort of feel a little off track because I'm still thinking about the presentation that Rod did. And so I can't help but think about how when we work with folks, our clients who walk in to seek services, or we're dealing with an emergency crisis situation, that our work really centers around person, client, victim, survivor, self-determination, and beginning with where they're at, right? And so I was sort of thinking about that when I had this PowerPoint in front of me, and just thinking about the curiosities that came up for me, and the thoughts that were sparked in my own mind after listening to the previous presentation. And so some of the things I just kind of wanted to share those thoughts with you. One of the things that came up for me, of course, is when I shared with Mr. Cascala what my feeling and thought was about the group process, and how powerful that can be when working with persons that have caused harm. So that was one of the thoughts that I had shared earlier. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is how important trust is, and how important building a trust relationship is with victims and survivors, and even our offenders. They have no reason, none of those folks have no reason to trust us, really, right? When we know that their trust has been eroded by the kinds of harmful experiences and scary experiences that they've had. And so if I expect someone to trust me right away, boy, do I have it all wrong. And I should be thinking about things that I need to do as a professional to create an environment to instill a trust relationship, to build and sustain a trust relationship with anyone that I'm working with. And so that was the other thing that sparked for me when I was listening to Rod's presentation. And the other thing was thinking about privilege. You know, I think Rod talked about power and control and privilege, and how sometimes even as helpers, we don't recognize the kind of privilege that we might have, that we often don't think about. I mean, we as helping professionals, we don't think about ourselves as having the kind of privilege when we think about privilege in general, if we're thinking about equality and social justice. But we really do. As providers, we're in a place of authority. And so that kind of goes hand in hand with trust building, and the kind of privilege that folks that we're working with might think that we have over them, that sort of thing. And then the part about power and control, and how women and young girls have felt like their power. I mean, this is just in talking with victims and survivors, how they will often say, I just feel like powerless, and I feel like my power has been taken away, my power to choose, the power to love, the power to make choices, the power to go to work, the power, about everything. And how when we have offender accountability opportunities, how we can, in a healthy way, begin to restore that power again, so that there's the power to choose once again. And so that was another thought that came up for me as I was listening to him speak. And then I just wanted to go back to a comment that someone had left at the end of my presentation, and that was, it wasn't at the end. It was somewhere where someone said, sorry, I'm going back to it. Michelle Ben, Michelle Ben, I'm reading your comment at 2:04 p.m. and you said something about building motivation in survivors. They will want to contemplate change. Freedom to be myself. Okay, freedom. So I kind of equated that with power too. But building motivation in survivors, and also building motivation when we work with offenders or relative offenders. And when Rod was talking about the different kinds of changes that his group members engage in, I can't help but think about how important it is to think about ways to sustain that change. Okay, because as I have heard offenders often say, I don't want to do this. I don't want to create harm. I don't want her to feel scared, afraid of me all the time. You know, the things that she does for me are not because she wants to do them. It's because she's afraid of me. You know, and just looking at what motivates people to do things. And so when a person says that, I don't want to live like this, I don't want her to live like this, that really is an opportunity to kind of look at that motivation for change. Okay, let's talk about how we can sustain where you're you're at a good place right now. How can we sustain that? What can we do? What can you do? What can I do? What can your community do? The other thing that came up for me as I was hearing Jolene speak before we went on break was, gosh, I wrote it down somewhere, about the different ways that our community, comes up with creative and innovative activities and events to help our offenders be accountable to their community, to their victims, to their survivors, and how to give back. And she talked about, you know, like the community gardening and all those ways, because when you perpetrate violence onto a person, it's to the entire community, everybody, because remember earlier we talked about how everybody is impacted, and how to give back. And so that, along with what Jolene said, I was thinking about our attempts to reintegrate folks back into our community, especially folks that have been incarcerated or folks that have been sent to rehabilitation centers. You know, perhaps they have a substance abuse issue that is a contributing factor to what's going on. There's a correlation between that. Remember earlier we were talking about causation and correlation and the distinctions between those two. As I was hearing Jolene talk about the corn stalk and looking at the root causes, and then all the other things that are happening, the correlation factors sort of thing. And so this reintegration process reminded me of how our communities do or do not prepare for our members of our native communities to come back into Isla del Pueblo, Sandia, whatever community it might be. Because I tell you, I kid you not, that 95% of our folks that are incarcerated for crimes against persons or property, they come back into their communities. This is where they want to be. And so maybe we're not doing enough to prepare us as providers of service delivery, to prepare our families that have been harmed, to prepare our community, to prepare everyone, to prepare the person that's been incarcerated. What kind of preparedness are we doing? Especially when we talk about emergency preparedness, we don't ever talk about this piece of it. We talk about natural disasters, right? Things that happen, fires, floods, all of that, but we don't talk about human kinds of experiences such as this, violence against persons and crimes against persons, and how we integrate people back successfully into their communities. Because if we don't do a good job of that, they're going to wind up back in the system. it's difficult to survive when you don't have the right supports in place for everyone, for us, for them, law enforcement, community, everyone. So I just kind of wanted to share those reflections that came up for me. Remember earlier, I was asking you to think about those reflective prompts. And so I was taking advantage of that for myself. And what came up for me is reflection inquiry 4, reflection prompt 4. What kind of curiosity or curiosities have you had now have a result of this presentation training session the whole day? And so, and then also, what does offender accountability look like in your community? Some of those things have been addressed in the presentations that we've heard over the last couple of hours and probably this morning as well. So I just wanted to share that with you, and please feel free to share any reflections that you might have. And so, so we know that domestic violence, family violence, and intimate partner violence, stalking, all of that are global human rights and public health concerns. We know that, right? And so it's very important for us to recognize that on a smaller scale in our communities, those continue to be human rights and public health concerns in all of our Native communities. And so we also know that intimate partner violence especially is associated with a range of adverse physical, mental, sexual, and reproductive outcomes. And so we have to be concerned about that. And because we work closely with the medical providers in instances when folks have had to, when folks required, their injuries required medical care. So someone was talking earlier about the importance of the multidisciplinary approach. And so when we are working with victims of harm and survivors, we have to have a good acceptance of that very real phenomena of working with others that are providing services that are specialized in various areas with our population. So let me just looking at it from a different kind of perspective, but related at the same time, is looking at this from a multicultural practice model when we are working with offenders in our community, and recognizing that the multicultural practice model is really an emerging practice, right? We didn't always embrace it the way that we do right now, only because we thought that generalizing was okay and that it was acceptable. And now we've come to respect the idea is that it really is a multicultural perspective, and that we can't generalize, and we have to be concerned about individual communities, individual organizations, individual kinds of distinctions and characteristics that make up a community. And what's important to one community might not be as significant. It might be a shared concern. It might be a shared value. But maybe the action around it might look differently. Okay, so emerging practice really has to do with embracing a community-based model that has a social justice perspective. And so when we talk about social justice, we're coming from a place of the kind of things that people deserve, individuals and families and communities, and the equitable distribution of wealth, for example, socioeconomic opportunities, work opportunities, and educational opportunities, as I had mentioned in my previous presentation, and the kinds of privileges that we're able to acknowledge that we may or may not have. And so that's really important when we think about the social justice perspective, because as helpers in the field, we really are advocates, right? Many of you probably in this training session are advocates, and advocates really have a place to be in helping to shape the policies that currently exist, and helping to develop policies based on our observations and based on our assessments of things that work really, really well and the things that haven't worked so well, right? And looking at it from an equitable kind of perspective. The other thing that the multicultural practice model helps us to see is the value in capacity building. And this is all going to kind of make sense at the end when we talk about offender accountability, is our capacity building. What does that look like for each of our organizations? Because we all work together and we're all collectively impacted, and we all have collective concerns about how domestic violence, family violence, intimate partner violence, the kind of collective impact that it has on our community. So because of that, we have to be concerned about the level of capacity within our programs, within our service delivery program, and to also recognize where the gaps in service delivery exist, right? And that can only happen if we are becoming really good at conducting an assessment of all of our programs. And so capacity building, really then, once we determine where that's at in each of our Native communities, helps us to develop the kind of training opportunities that are needed in order to continue to build that capacity, and also helps us to come up with innovative prevention alternatives from a trauma-informed practice base. Okay, so coming up with preventative kinds of interventions that are geared towards a trauma-informed practice base. The other thing that a multicultural practice model does is it really looks at and examines what the strengths-based approach might look like when we look at the strengths in any given community. Okay, so for example, if we have, if you're hearing that there's a collective response or a collective concern about what domestic violence is doing to your community, that's really a strength, right? It's not a strength that the violence is happening, but the fact that there are multiple members in your community that are concerned about it is a strength, taking a strengths-based approach and accepting that and acknowledging that that community has the strength in numbers, because that many number of people are concerned enough about it. When we have enough concerns about it, folks are more inclined to do something about that. So it becomes action oriented. The multicultural practice model also is engaged in collaborative work with the community, and really it begins with the level of awareness of where each given community is at. So for example, if I am wanting to do a awareness raising campaign around child abuse and neglect, sexual assault, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, I really have to gauge the level of awareness of where my community is at. So if I start at a place of trying to raise awareness and my community is not there yet, it's kind of like a futile effort on my part. And we learned that lesson the hard way. I know in our community, we learned that lesson the hard way many years ago when folks maybe were ambitious and they wanted folks to get up here, but they were down here at their level of awareness. And so we have to begin with innovative ideas and creative ideas about how to reach the next level of awareness. You know, it's a work in progress. And so the collaborative work that we do with our community from a multicultural practice model really begins with the current level of awareness that your community is at. The other thing that it does is it looks at the community, informal community-based services that families often rely on. Right? Yeah, we know that There's formal structures in place for protective services and law enforcement and behavioral health. And if someone is experiencing health issues, we have our healthcare organization. So those are kind of like your formal kinds of resources that are available in your community. But if we're coming from an understanding of an informal community-based service approach and embracing that, we're also looking at individuals in your community, family in your community, your overall community, what does your community events, what kind of community events that are taking place in your pueblo, for example, how does that engage people from all areas, each geographical area of your community. And then finally, looking at the organization of your community and how that collectively comes together in order to provide the services that are needed. And then the other thing that we look at is what is your family's relationship to the community. Okay, and we know, and I know this from my own community, when we have had individuals that have offended and reoffended time after time, or they've struggled with substance abuse issues, whatever the situation might be, or they've been called out for neglect, unintentional neglect to their children as a result of a number of different factors. We know that those particular families and individuals may be isolated from the greater community because people feel bad, or they don't feel included, or they feel like, as we talked about earlier, that they've been judged, and they're not invited to events for a number of different reasons. And so one of the things that we do in the work that we do with our victims, survivors, and offenders is engaging the level of connection that each of those families and each of those individuals have with their community. That's really important for us to take into consideration. And then the other thing that we look at is what type of factors exist in your community that offer protection. Okay, what kind of factors exist in your community that offer protection? And what kind of risk factors alongside that compromise safety in your community? Okay, what kinds of things are we seeing, and what kinds of things are we hearing about that offer protection, and what kinds of things are we hearing about, and what kinds of things are we seeing that compromise safety in your community? Okay, yeah. So let me move on to the next slide. Sorry. The other thing that we look at, especially when we're conducting assessments in wanting to learn more about how victims and survivors are impacted, and this has a lot to do with how it shapes where they're at, how that shapes their decision-making power. Okay, how that shapes their decision-making power. And so a lot of times victims and survivors are new to any given community, might be new to a community. Perhaps they had just moved there, or maybe, and maybe we want to think about the reasons for why they relocated to the community. Or maybe you've had a family in your community that has experienced domestic violence, and then they relocated to a different community. And we have to think about the reasons for that, right? When they're out of sight, when our families are out of sight, we want to make sure that they're not out of our minds. Okay, we want to make sure that we know where they're going, especially if this is still a family that is susceptible to ongoing kinds of harmful situations. And if we're for certain that the risk factors that existed that place them in harm's way have not been eradicated. Okay. The other thing that we look at is the language within any given community, and Rod kind of talked about this, is how language and customs and traditions are really the strengths that that make up much of our community in our Native communities, and the kinds of barriers that might exist if we're not able to indulge in being able to have courageous conversations with others that understand us from the way that we speak or the way that we convey messages back and forth between one another. Okay, so that's really important. The other piece that we often will evaluate is what are individuals and families and communities' health beliefs and values around health, including mental health concerns or substance abuse concerns, and how that is viewed as creating a healthy, balanced individual, both physically and mentally and emotionally, right? And so we know that many of our victims and survivors of domestic violence probably don't do the best job that they can in taking care of their health. Number one, because they're isolated and they haven't been able to, for whatever reason, they haven't been able to keep their appointments, or they've not, because of the fears that have been instilled in them, they're not able to go anywhere. You know, that's the same reason that a lot of kids miss school, you know, because once kids get to the age of being able to articulate what is going on in their homes, parents, victims and survivors included, become concerned about sending their children to school, because children are innocent, right? And children talk. You know, they talk to other kids, they talk to their teachers, not for the intention of getting anyone in trouble, but this is what's happening in their world. And so kids talk about that. And then the other assessment, the other part of the assessment that's really important when we work with our victims and our survivors and our Native offenders is taking inventory of the kinds of crisis events and the adverse childhood and adult experiences that they've had, and the lived experiences that they've encountered, and the trauma, including historical trauma, that they have been subjected to. Those are all things that are important for us as helpers to be able to take inventory of when we're looking at a multicultural practice model and conducting our assessments, because the multicultural perspective is going to give us an idea about how they look at those things. Language, health beliefs, and the crisis events and lived experiences that they have. What kind of meaning does it serve, and what kind of purpose does it serve for them in order to be able to begin to talk about those things? Okay. So the multicultural practice model, again, looks at the contact with the cultural identity that we, or ethnic identity that we earlier had talked about, recognizing that as a source of strength for many of our individuals and the kind of contact that those individuals have with their community. The more contact that individuals and families have with the community, the more aware that the community becomes about their set of circumstances. Okay, and so this kind of takes away from the earlier feelings of aloneness that people encounter, and the feelings of isolation that people have because they're disengaged from the rest of their community. And then the other piece that this looks at is the values about work and education, and how often are those opportunities made available for every family in your community. And then the values about family, and what are people talking about with regard to family interactions. How is respect conveyed? How is respect demonstrated? And how do people manage conflicts? You know, when we are taking inventory and talking about that assessment piece, one of the things that we often talk about is, how do people manage conflicts in your home? You know, how do people manage disagreements? Because we're individuals, right? And we're unique, and we have our own set of beliefs and values. And so we're entitled to our own opinions. But in families that are conflicted, those differing values and different opinions are often rise to the level of escalated conflict. And this is when harm often happens to certain members of the family, is when we're able to talk about some of our own opinions that we might have. We often are asking people to place themselves at risk when we take that kind of a chance. So we have to be able to have a good conversation, a meaningful conversation about how people manage conflicts in their home. The other thing that that this tells us is in each of these areas, how are we able to creatively and innovatively talk about preventative work that does not escalate into a situation where persons are harmed, right? And so one of the things that came to mind earlier as I was listening to an earlier conversation is how our schools, when we talk about educational opportunities, how our schools at the earlier the better, right? So when we're talking about kids that are in the elementary school stage, for example, that schools are an important setting often for primary prevention opportunities, right? Why is that? Why do we think that our schools, especially at the elementary age level, are an important setting for primary prevention initiatives? Because we can talk about relationships, right, that kids have with one another. What a perfect time to begin to have those conversations with young kids, right? The kinds of relationships that they establish and maintain and sustained with other kids at school, with their teachers, with their counselors, with administrative staff at school, with bus drivers. Bus drivers know a lot, right? And often the folks that work in the cafeteria have many opportunities to observe children at school. The other opportunity at the school level is that kids get to examine, even though they're not able to say it, they are thinking about perhaps the different kind of gender roles, right? When we hear kids saying, oh, my mom can't go to work. My dad said that my mom has to stay at home all day and that she has to take care of the kids or whatever. Then we begin to then get a sense for where kids are at with their understanding of the different kinds of gender roles that are apparent in their own households. The other thing that we often have an opportunity to see at the school level early on is the power and coercion, as we begin to examine the interactions that kids have with one another, or examine the interactions that kids have with adults at school. And, what does their language look like? What kinds of words are we hearing them speak? And where is that coming from, right? And so we have an opportunity to intervene with kids at that level. The other thing that we get to examine at that primary level of prevention is being able to examine youth violence and bullying, okay? I know in Isleta Pueblo for a few years, we're concerned about the amount of bullying that was taking place at the elementary school, even more so than what we were seeing at middle school. And so what an opportunity for us to be able to intervene at that level before kids transition into middle school, right? Because then it could get worse. We hear horror stories about all the things that happen in middle schools and the high schools. And so what an opportunity for us to begin to address youth violence and bullying that often happens at the schools. So the kinds of dialogue in order to remain culturally sensitive and to be specific with regard to our own practice is to be able to understand what a skilled dialogue looks like, right? And why that's important. The dialogues that we're having with folks are with folks that we are treating folks that have been victims, folks that have been survivors, folks that have witnessed violence, and also other people in the helping profession that we are collaborating and coordinating service delivery with, right? So that skilled dialogue looks like and feels like and should be respectful at all levels, right? And if we are feeling like that respect is lacking, what a great opportunity for us to build capacity in that area, right? One of the things that I have often heard in my own experience of working with others is people have their own set ideas about how things should be, right? And we have a really hard, we, meaning all of us, have a really hard time listening to a different kind of approach, you know, because we believe in a certain way and we believe that this works with everybody. And when somebody comes in with a new idea, we have a really hard time with that. And so we don't pay as much attention to it as we probably should. And so that capacity building really has an important role in the way that we build respect, the way that we maintain respect, the way that we sustain respect, especially with others that might have a different opinion than ours, okay? The other piece of skilled dialogue has to do with encouraging reciprocity. You know, so when you think of reciprocity, what comes to mind for you, right? What are some of the ideas that you have about encouraging reciprocity? We want to make sure that when we have a dialogue with another person, that it's an ongoing conversation and an ongoing meaningful dialogue between two people, that you're not doing all the talking, that you're allowing the other person to share just as much as you're sharing, right? And so we want to make sure that there's two-way communication and that we respect that and we encourage that. This is especially important when we are working with victims, survivors, and offenders of violence. Okay, we want to know from the offender what is helpful to you. You know, what feels good to you? What has not been helpful to you? And what has been discouraging to you? I want to know. I can't decide by myself what kind of intervention is going to be put into place. It's got to be something that you are motivated to engage in because you know what helps. And you're the expert in the things that help you and the expert in things that have not been too helpful for you. Okay. The other piece that skilled dialogue includes is embracing responsiveness, right? And the way that we respond to people a lot of times is influenced by our own values, our own beliefs, and our own attitudes about violence, right? And so we have to be in tune with where we're at. We have to know ourselves really well. That level of self-awareness that I had talked about earlier is really critical, right? Because we want to embrace responsiveness that is with care, that is with compassion, and that is non-judgmental, okay? And so checking ourselves all the time, right? Making sure that we are in check and that we are centered. And that earlier exercise that Tatiana had done with us about that experiential exercise about self-care and mindfulness is really important, because if it becomes too much and we're feeling overwhelmed, we have a duty to ourselves in order to do good self-care, okay? So that we do right by our clients. And then the other part of skilled dialogue that's important is recognizing when safety is compromised, right? Recognizing when safety is compromised. And this is coming from a place of a service provider. Perhaps you're a service provider, you're a victim advocate, you're in the medical profession, or maybe you're a community member in your native community or other community. And to be able to recognize when safety is compromised and to be able to say something about it, right? Like Tiffany, earlier, you had said something about, I don't know if Tiffany, are you still here? Yeah. When you had asked the question about saying something, and your last comment was, I think, knowing that we can't just stay silent, right? I think that was your comment. Knowing that we can't just, we know something needs to be said, But sorry, I'm distracted because I'm trying to get back to that. It can be scary, but you don't want to stay silent, right? We don't
Right.
want to stay. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, yes, I'm here and great. Thank you.
Yeah. So we want to make sure that the voice is heard, right? And if the voice of our victim is not able to be heard, that we're the advocate for that person, and that we say something about that. We know it's happening. I always say we want to be able to sleep at night, right? We want to go home from our jobs and we want to be able to sleep at night. And if we're not sure that our victims are not safe, we're not going to be able to sleep. Okay. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to say about that is we can't be indifferent, right? It's kind of like, oh wow, like that picture that Rod showed us of the van and the different feelings that people have. One of them was being indifferent, and I think the gesture was kind of like, oh well, kind of thing. We can't be indifferent to this epidemic. It's a public health concern, and it's global, it's national, it's regional, it's local. Okay. And so we can't stay silent, and we can't be indifferent about it. So we talked about no generalizations. The cross-cultural perspective is really important for us to look at and consider, because it helps us to also embrace cultural humility. We don't know what we don't know, right? Until we do, and until we start asking questions that are healthy and that are appropriate and enables us to take healthy risk at wanting to know more. The things that we can know, the things that we should know, the things that we should be aware of, and to increase our knowledge base, and to say, you know what, I didn't know that. But I learned that from you. And so earlier when I said that I consider myself to be a teacher and a learner, I truly mean that. I can teach things, but I can also, there's a lot for me to learn. And I learn it from people that have been harmed, and sometimes people have been harmed by the very systems that are set up to help them. And so we have to make sure that we keep ourselves in check as well. So embracing cultural humility and recognizing how important it is to learn. And then putting into place interventions that are culturally relevant and culturally sensitive and culturally responsive, given the community. Okay, so what works in Isleta Pueblo may not work in Picaris. Okay, and so having a good working knowledge base from which to start from. Having an atmosphere of trust and comfort. That was something that was sparked, a thought that was sparked, and that I took note of when I was hearing Rod speak, how important trust is, that trust building relationship, because the folks that we work with that come to our attention for the first time, or they come to us for the first time, they don't have any reason to trust us. People that they have trusted in the past were the same persons that created a harmful situation for them. Okay, so why would they trust us? We have to demonstrate that we have the capacity within us in order to build an environment that is safe and secure, that helps to facilitate a meaningful dialogue and engagement with those people that haven't been able to trust. Okay, so an atmosphere of trust and comfort, and allowing people to take the lead in whatever it is that they need to tell us and whatever it is they want us to know. And then recognizing our own limits and taking the position of not knowing everything, and relying on the expertise of our clients, and relying on the specialized expertise of others that we collaborate and coordinate with, right? That's the best that we can give to our clients, is to say, this is what I can do, and these are the areas that I'm not able to provide assistance in. However, I do know who can, right? So we never leave are folks that we're trying to help in the dark. If we can't help them, then we find a way to figure out how someone else can help them. Okay. So initiatives to reduce violence in our community requires our commitment, right? Requires our commitment. And those of you that work in this field know what that level of commitment looks like. You know, it's, you guys are working all hours, you know, beyond 8 to 5 or 8 to 4. And sometimes folks are on call and you guys are working on the weekends as well. And so it requires a level of commitment, and also requires us to have a vision, that vision that we talked about earlier. I know I had mentioned it briefly in my presentation, and then Rod talked about it too. What does the vision look like? And then now we have the duty to act on that, because we have a vision of how we want things to be. And some of you had shared some really good ideas in the chat about what that vision might look like. You know, what do you want your community to look like? And that question can be asked of our victims, our survivors, and our Native offenders as well. Okay, so it becomes a holistic kind of approach, because there's been collective impact. And so that collective impact has to have some say so in everything that we do in our intervention approaches. And then we know that we have to act now, because as highlighted in the United Nations campaign against violence against women, their quote was, "Women won't wait. Women won't wait because maybe it becomes too late," right? Women won't wait. And so the responses that we have in our giving communities have to be right now, taking all those things into consideration. Okay. So how do we build capacity within? We talked a little bit about this earlier. Sorry, I'm trying to look at my timeline here. Am I still okay with time? Sorry.
Yes, you have about 17 minutes.
Okay, good. Okay, so building capacity from within, if you think in terms of your own communities, and what are some of the things that you might be thinking about, or what are some, if any of you had an opportunity to look at the reflective prompts again, these were some of the questions there, right? So building capacity within has to do with training, right? Earlier, we had talked about what capacity building looks like, and how that cross training is really, really critical for everyone, and how important it is to make sure that we are doing our community assessments in a way that helps to gauge a level of awareness of where our communities are at. Because once we have that, once we know where our communities are at, then that helps us to develop our community awareness raising initiatives around, beginning with where the community is at, and also making sure that our community is trauma informed, and that we have enough conversations about that. We have ongoing conversations about that. The prevention piece I talked about with regard to beginning where your community is at, and then having a non-judgmental approach. When we work with our offenders, having a non-judgmental approach is different than we're not condoning the behavior that they've engaged in. We're not condoning the harm that has been perpetrated by them, the actions that they took. We want to know about the things that have been harmful for them as well, right? What kinds of things have they experienced in their own lives, and to be able to leave space for that. And then making sure as service providers that one of the other ways that we build capacity from within is to make sure that we are doing enough about addressing secondary traumatic stress and embracing self-care. Okay. And then healing the spirit. I often have heard folks say, gosh, you know, I'm kind of in this is like going to be my life, the rest of my life. I'm not sure that I can do this again. I feel broken. I feel like, you know, it's kind of like their spirit, even the person that they are in here, their total well-being, their total being is just like broken and harmed. And it feels so hopeless in a lot of ways. And so one of our ethical responsibility is to restore hope, right? And to build hope and to look forward into the future and help them to create a vision that's going to be helpful for them. And the way that we do that, a number of ways. You might have a number of ways that you've done this with people that you serve, but having empathy, right? And caring and being compassionate and being real and genuine, and being able to understand and share the feelings that they might have, right? We may not have experienced the same kind of situation that they did, but we can understand what it feels like to be hurt. You know, we understand hurt and we understand pain. Maybe not from the same thing, but we can relate to pain, and we can relate to hurt, and we can relate to feeling broken a lot of times, okay? Having a human rights approach, right? Restoring human rights. That's so important for both victims and offenders, right? So honoring that basic humanity, honoring basic humanity of those that have harmed, right? Or those that, for example, are incarcerated, right? We look at this all the time, rights that have been violated, human rights violations for offenders that have been incarcerated and be mistreated at their places of incarceration, and making sure that we are paying attention to that, and making sure that we are viewing rehabilitation as a primary goal instead of incarceration, right? And we will hear victims that will often say, you know, sending him to jail isn't, and yeah, I know that there's things that people do that requires them to be in jail. You know, they've done, you know, there's been atrocious acts of violence and crimes against person, and they need to be in jail. But how many times, if you think about it, I know I've heard this more than a couple of times, is when I call the police, I know he's going to go to jail, but nothing happens when he goes to jail. What about other approaches? He's got a substance abuse issue. He's got an anger control issues. Can we address that? Can that be dealt with? Can that be addressed? Because if that's not addressed, and he does 12 months of incarceration and he comes back out the same person, back into the same community, and we haven't prepared ourselves, prepared our victim and survivor, that person is going back to the same situation he was in. Okay, and so looking at that, really at that, looking at our criminal justice systems and making sure that we're evaluating what compliance looks like once they're incarcerated. Healing the spirit also has to do with experiencing humility, and not humiliation on their side, but humiliation on the side of the service provider, as I spoke about earlier. And then having a sense of where we're at with promoting health. You know, what are our own beliefs and our values about promoting health and holistic health, if you would. And then respecting the stories and listening to the stories, and looking at basic needs. If we are expecting our victims and survivors and offenders to engage in the change process, what are some of their overwhelming needs that haven't been met, that take some overboard when we expect them to engage in services? Okay, so do they have food, clothing, shelter? Are they safe? Food, clothing, shelter. You know, if they don't have that, that's what their primary concern is. Okay. And then having a sense of a healthy level of spirituality and instilling hope. You know, who do you rely on? What kinds of belief system do you rely on in order to instill hope? Okay. So this slide just kind of talks about having a trauma-informed care setting and what that looks like in any given community, and what you would expect, fully integrating that knowledge of trauma-informed care into your setting, and having policies and procedures that address trauma-informed care. and then practicing. So it's one thing to have policies and procedures in place, but it's another to then put those things in practice. Okay, so practicing trauma-informed care, and then finally, all agencies in your community are trauma-informed, and how that is related to building that level of capacity that we talked about that is helpful to people that we serve. Okay, and just kind of some principles and values of a trauma-informed organization are the following. You have a safe environment, emotional safety, physical safety, all of those things, okay? You have a system-wide understanding. You're sharing that information with everybody. There's a good level of understanding with the expectation that people are going to be learning more about that, and that you understand that cultural competence in your organization, in all of your organization, is really a process that is a lifelong process. I consider it to be a lifelong process, and that we give credence to the lived experience, voice, choice, and advocacy. People being able to make choices for themselves. And that recovery and healing is lived experience driven, and that we embrace healing. We're hopeful even for those circumstances where people have re-offended over and over again, okay? We're honest, and we are building trust relationships, and that we are, as service providers and as helpers in the field, that we have a good level of openness to feedback and ongoing performance improvement. And sometimes this is so important, folks. People can be, and organizations can be, threatened by this, right? And so when we talk about evaluation, and especially we are working with outcomes-based programs, and we're supposed to be doing evaluation, you know, it's kind of like a scary, you know, to think about that. And some folks might get threatened by that, but we have to be open to that, right? Because we want to make sure that we are continuously looking at improving the way that we do things, you know, looking at ways that could have potentially been more harmful than good, and looking at ways that we can continue enhancing the ways that are often helpful to people that we serve. Okay, so this is the piece that I really was excited to share with you, because we are often wanting to look at the feedback that we get from folks that are helpers, social workers, counselors, advocates, nurses, doctors, whomever, right? You know, what is your, you know, tell us what works and what is helpful to you. And a lot of times we don't think about, as I was talking about, the feedback that we get from others and ongoing performance improvement. We have to be willing to look at the help seekers, the people that are seeking help from us, and what are some of their perspectives, and what are some of the things that they have said, you know, about seeking help, or why weren't you not open to that, or what was complicated about that, or what were some of the barriers. Okay, this is what they have said. Okay. The barriers that they identified were that they were made to feel shameful when they sought help in the past. And this is for offenders, okay? This is for offenders as much as it is for victims and survivors, is we were made to feel shamed. You know, we were shamed. We couldn't trust the folks that we went to because they talked behind our backs. They shared this information with others when they said that they wouldn't. And so this is really important when we first meet with people, right? We have to be able to share with them, you know, the limits of keeping information private, right? The limits of keeping information confidential. You know, we all know, you all probably know that when someone is in a situation where harm is going to be done to another person, or they are threatening somebody, that we really need to say something about that, right? But we also need to let the folks that are getting help from us, we need to let them know that. We need to disclose that, and we need to be transparent about that. Okay, so shame, trust, discrimination, they were treated differently. Judgment, they were judged. Fear in their hearts and in their minds. There was fear. This is for both victims, survivors, and our relatives that have offended. Fear in the hearts and minds. And lack of safe spaces. There wasn't enough of a safe space created for them in order to continue to seek the help that they needed. Okay, so this is coming from the help seeker's perspective. Okay, we know that they know that domestic violence is prevalent in Native communities. Okay, they know that domestic violence is prevalent in Native communities. They also know that that prevalence is hidden, and their help-seeking opportunities and help-seeking behaviors does not coincide with this prevalence. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that often domestic violence is underreported. Okay, so when we are doing our studies and our research, we are most often sharing information about the reports that have been made, but we also know in all reality that there has been underreporting of instances where people have been harmed, or there was a report today on that particular situation, but there's a history of a number of incidences that have taken place with that person. Okay, so we want to make sure that we look at the history of that person that comes to us for the first time, and we create a safe environment for them to speak of that. Otherwise, we're not going to know that this is the worst that it got, and maybe there were other worse events. There were other events that happened that were near worse, okay, or that were just as bad. But we don't know about it because they weren't reported. And the other thing that comes up often from help seekers' perspective is that they recognize that domestic violence is a multifaceted problem, complicated and made worse by social issues such as racism, low socioeconomic status, and poor educational outcomes. And as if people don't already feel bad about that, right? People already have feelings about that, and they feel isolated by their circumstances. And so because of their fears of shame and trust, discrimination, judgment, they don't come to us. Us just meaning globally, that this is what happens. And then the other one is recognizing that isolated Native communities are at higher risk, and ongoing oppression can lead to increased levels of violence, right? So when we don't make those opportunities better for them, educational opportunities, socioeconomic status, privileges that are enjoyed by others, work opportunities, whatever the case might be, especially in isolated communities, we know that that level of ongoing oppression can lead to increased levels of violence. Okay, we know it's not the cause, each one of those things alone, but certainly there's a correlation. Okay, and it's a significant factor, contributing factor. Okay, so the help seeking behaviors that often were identified for those that said that these things work and these are the things that don't work are looking at punitive versus supportive approaches. Okay, so when you think about punitive approaches, what might come to mind for you, right? And when you make a distinction between those approaches and the kinds of approaches that could be supportive, what comes to mind for you then? Anybody? Anybody?
And you also have the option of dropping this into the chat, y'all. I know it takes maybe a good 15 seconds to kind of reflect and come up with an answer.
Yeah, so take your time. So think about the punitive approaches that maybe our criminal justice system has in place, that your own Native community has in place with your tribal court and law enforcement and juvenile probation, adult probation, all of those things. What kinds of punitive approaches are still happening, need to continue happening, or maybe those that you can substitute and find alternative ways by replacing them with supportive kinds of approaches. Okay, so that's kind of a reflective question. And then the help-seeking folks also recognizing that they are aware that violence impacts the community and the culture. Okay, and also recognizing the balance of historical mistreatment and judgment that arises as a result of that. And then the other thing that was identified is fear of losing their children. Fear of losing their children, as was done during earlier generations. Okay, so speaking to that historical trauma that people are still impacted by collectively. And so fear of losing their children if they say anything, right? And so that's still a real fear that people have, even though this doesn't happen as often as it used to, especially if we have a protective person, a protective parent. This doesn't always happen, but there's that real fear that it could happen. And then there's the reality that sometimes children have to be placed, right? Because both of them were involved in that situation, and the victim may not have the level of capacity, protective capacity that we need in order to ensure that the children are going to remain safe. Okay. Okay, let's see. I think we've got one more slide left. And then the other thing that was element that was identified is recognizing that shame is a complex and motivating emotion that people have difficulty in separating from a real desire for help. Okay, and just as service providers, this is something that is really important for us to recognize, that shame is a complex and motivating emotion that people have difficulty in separating from a real desire for help. Okay, and so how to move from this place is often determined by help seekers and utilizing a community-based approach. Okay, this is really helpful for us to be able to recognize when we work with folks. So then looking at the restorative justice framework, how many of you are familiar with the restorative justice approach that was that came out of the criminal justice system in the 1970s? Anybody? Paige, do you have your hand up and you want to enlighten us? I thought she had her hand up. Did she have her hand up?
Oh, Paige said that they're having audio trouble.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but feel free to drop that into the chat page if you'd like to yeah, school us, send us some knowledge.
Yeah. This is something that is, it's not a new concept. It's filled with it's got support. It has had support. It continues to have support, but it's also had their experience with criticism, especially from those that worked with victims and survivors of violence. And so the restorative justice approach really came out of the criminal justice system in the 1970s as a way for the courts to examine the ways in which healing could be restored. So it incorporated a healing framework with it, in how to balance accountability with healing, and how to mitigate all of that. And the questions that came up often is, does the victim have to come face to face with her offender? And so that was still a scary thing, and it's still a scary thing nowadays, right? And so we are still in the middle of looking at this and coming up with, maybe other innovative approaches that don't take into account the things that needed to happen in the 1970s as a way for the courts to examine how healing would take place. And so over the years, as I mentioned, the restorative justice approach has received some support, because basically we want healing to take place, right? We want everyone to heal. And at that time, the healing was geared towards more the victim and the survivor of violence, and didn't speak too much at that time with regard to offenders. And so it's received criticism, as I mentioned, especially from those that were working with offenders. And so some of the concerns that advocates in particular, had with regard to the restorative justice approach, had their concerns were with bringing the victim and offender together, bringing them together to have a dialogue. It was kind of like the what is it called? The mediation. The mediation approach, and folks not feeling comfortable with coming face to face with the person that had perpetrated harm to them because of their fears, the concerns about safety, the opportunities that the offender may have or be given to blame the victim, and other kinds of concerns that may have come up during that time. So those are real concerns that folks have, right? And so we have to give credence to the kinds of concerns that people are voicing over that approach. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to pay attention. So built from native ideas, but appropriated and warped by being centered with settler systems, criticized for something to restore, and the burden on victim survivors and lack of accounting for unequal power paved the way in part for still emerging transformative justice efforts. Thank you for sharing that with us, Paige. I'm assuming that was Paige. And then there were many dialogues about whether or not forgiveness was required in order to move forward, right? And we still have multiple dialogues about that, whether or not forgiveness, there's a difference between forgiveness and forgetting. You're never going to forget, but folks have different views on whether or not victims and survivors have to be able to forgive their offenders in order to continue healing. And so, everybody has their own ideas about that. And so there are many other approaches which created balance, such as the peacemaking approach, which involves everyone impacted, including the community. I know that our tribal court here in Isleta had incorporated into their practice the peacemaking process, which is built on a consensus building model. And I'm not really sure if it has worked with domestic violence cases at this point, but we have that in place for for like probate matters and truancy kinds of issues, or maybe like bullying types of things that are going on, and there's a peacemaker that is identified that leads the process. It's a court-based program, but there's no judge. And so it allows all the parties to collectively come together and share all their ideas and to build consensus in a healthy way. And so it allows everybody to have a voice in that process. And so, yeah. Sorry, I didn't share the last slide. Here it is. Okay, so that concludes my presentation. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything they want to share, or maybe some ideas that may have been sparked, a curiosity about something. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Caroline.
Yeah.
Are there any questions before we close out for the day?
Hi, this is Tiffany. I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to thank Jolene for putting this very heavy training out there. And it definitely, was pretty heavy for me today, especially experiencing this on a personal level and trying to advocate for others. And I just want to thank you all for your incredible knowledge and for continuously being here to show for all of us, to teach us important things and how to, safely do this work. And I'm just so grateful for being in this space with you all today. I felt like I was in class in school, and that's how engaging it was for me. And I'm so happy I had the opportunity to be here and to listen to everyone's teachings and their own experiences. So I just wanted to give thanks to Caroline and Rod and you, Jolene, and the other individual that was here earlier this morning to give that presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome, Tiffany. I just, that was, I'm so glad you said what you said, because I think at the beginning of my earlier presentation today, it's really important for us to recognize the things that might trigger us, right? And the things that come up for us, and thinking about what got us into this work in the first place, right? And so I just want to invite everyone to make sure that you do something to take care of yourselves, and be mindful about that, and be present in the moment as you pay attention to what your own needs are.
Thank you so much for that question, Tiffany. And yes, you are certainly welcome. Always happy to be in space with you, sister. Any other questions or reflections folks would like to share with us before we close out today?
I just wanted to, this is Michelle from Illinois, but I just wanted to thank all of you as well. And I've been honored to sit in on a few speakers with you on different days. And every single time it just reminds me what we're lacking, just as an advocacy group, as a coalition, and here in the Midwest especially. Well, I think that's everywhere, but I just love the approach of love. You guys are all filled with love and peace. And yes, it's, triggering for, like you said, everyone knows someone or is a victim themselves, but coming at it with such peace is just amazing. And I can't wait to share these different models and everything the speaker said. So I just really appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Michelle. Really happy to be in space with you today as well. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close out. I want to thank each and every one of you for being on this journey with us today. I know it was a pretty dense day, but I hope it was comfortable. I hope you were able to really absorb and embrace these concepts in a very mindful and intentional way. We'll make sure to get the slides to you. We do have our survey link here in the chat. That lets us know how we're doing, and any kind of feedback that you might want to share with us. Please fill that out. After you fill out the survey, we will send you a certificate of completion for this 8-hour training. And with that, you all have a great day. Please be safe, drink some water, maybe go outside and take a deep breath and ground yourself to the earth. And we'll see you until our next training.